Every story has a beginning that most people never see, a quiet moment before the first light arrived, before the first creature stirred, before the world learned what it was supposed to be. The Pokémon timeline carries that same quiet weight, stretching back further than most players ever pause to consider, across eons of myth and geology and slow creation. And before you drift any further, please consider subscribing to join the Cozy Club for more journey like this, and let me know where in the world you are currently watching from tonight. There was a moment at the very start of everything, a void without shape or sound or direction, and from that void something stirred, something that carried within it the entire weight of what the world would eventually become. That moment belongs to a single egg, floating in darkness, containing everything that would ever be. Arceus is the name given to what hatched from that egg, though naming something so vast feels almost insufficient. The Pokémon that emerged from the primordial void was not built from anything that existed before, because nothing had existed before. It carried within it the capacity to shape time, to shape space, to define what antimatter meant in a universe that had not yet learned to hold itself together. There is a particular kind of stillness in imagining that moment, when a single being opened its eyes and found only emptiness waiting, and then chose to fill it. The act of creation that followed was not slow or uncertain. Arceus moved with purpose that felt almost instinctual, reaching outward from its own being to shape the fundamental forces that would allow everything else to follow. 3 beings emerged from that first great act of will, and their names carry the weight of everything they represent. Dialga was given dominion over time, the slow-turning force that would allow moments to follow one another in sequence. Palkia received dominion over space, the architecture that would give the universe its dimensions and allow distance to exist between things. And Giratina, shaped from antimatter, received a realm of its own, a distorted mirror of the universe called the distortion world, where the ordinary rules of existence no longer quite applied. These 3 are often called the creation trio, though that phrase understates how completely they define the conditions of existence itself. Without Dialga, there is no before or after, no sequence, no history. Without Palkia, there is no here or there, no distance, no space for any creature to inhabit. And without Giratina, the delicate balance between matter and antimatter would collapse, pulling everything into ruin. Arceus understood this balance instinctively. The banishment of Giratina to the distortion world was not punishment so much as placement, a recognition that certain forces are necessary precisely because they remain contained. There is something worth resting with here, in the image of the distortion world as a necessary counterpart to everything else. The world we inhabit, of the roots and towns and tall grass and shimmering ocean roots, all of it rests on top of this invisible foundation, balanced against a mirror reality that most people never see and never need to think about. Giratina moves through that mirror world with a grace that feels almost mournful, a creature of enormous power dwelling in a space defined by its separation from everything else. Its very existence is a kind of quiet testimony to the completeness of Arceus's design. After the 3 great forces were established, Arceus turned its attention to something more intimate in scale. 3 smaller beings came next, each one shaped to carry a trait that would eventually be passed into every living thing. Uxie received the gift of knowledge, the capacity to understand and to remember. Azelf received the gift of willpower, the force that allows creatures to act and to choose. And Mesprit received the gift of emotion, the quality that allows experience to matter, that turns perception into feeling. These 3 settled into Lake Acuity, Lake Valor, and Lake Verity in the region that would eventually be called Sinnoh, resting there in quiet guardianship of the traits they embodied. The arrangement feels almost deliberate in its elegance. Knowledge without willpower cannot act. Willpower without emotion cannot care about the consequences of its actions. Emotion without knowledge cannot understand what it feels. Together, the three lake guardians form something complete, a triangle of qualities that defines what it means to be a living, conscious, experiencing creature. Every Pokémon and every human that has ever walked these regions carries traces of all three, because Arceus designed it that way, because these traits were given as gifts to the entire living world rather than held by their guardians alone. Arceus created one more thing before withdrawing from direct involvement in the shaping of the world. The creature known as Mew came into being, small and ancient, and carrying within its genetic structure the blueprint for every Pokémon that would eventually follow. Mew is described in the lore as the ancestor of all Pokémon, and the implications of that ancestry are worth sitting with quietly. Every creature that has ever been cataloged, from the smallest caterpie resting on a leaf to the most ancient legendary sleeping beneath a mountain, traces its lineage back to a single small pink being that drifted through a world that was still learning what it was. After Mew, Arceus rested. The accounts of its departure are quiet and unhurried, as if the creator of everything recognized that the world it had built no longer needed its direct attention. The universe had its structure. The traits of conscious life had been distributed. The ancestor of all creatures was moving through the world. What happened next would unfold across millions of years, shaped by forces that Arceus had set in motion rather than ones it continued to guide directly. Before you drift off, maybe tap subscribe for more gentle videos, and let me know where you're listening from tonight. There is a particular quiet in thinking about the 300 million years that followed Arceus's withdrawal. The world existed, and Mew moved through it, and slowly from that single ancestor, the first branching lineages began to appear. The creatures that emerged in those ancient periods were nothing like the Pokémon that would eventually fill trading cards and Pokédex entries. They were older things, shaped by a world that was still cooling and shifting beneath them, still deciding where its continents would rest and how deep its oceans would run. Kabuto and Kabutops moved through shallow seas in those ancient epochs, their forms adapted to a world of warm coastal waters and abundant marine life. Omanite and Omastar existed alongside them, filtering water through their coiled shells, slow and patient creatures that had found a successful shape and held it for millions of years without needing to change. These are the creatures preserved in amber and stone, captured at the moment their lineages ended and held there across geological ages until human hands eventually learned to read the story, encoded in their fossilized remains. Aerodactyls soared through skies that no human had ever looked up at, hunting from above, in a world where everything beneath it was still arranging itself into the forms it would eventually stabilize into. There is something quietly extraordinary about a creature flying through air, breathed by no one, over oceans sailed by no vessel, watching a world that has not yet learned it is waiting for something. Aerodactyl could not have known what it was preceding. It simply lived with the total absorption of a creature that has never been asked to be anything other than what it already is. The ancient seas held other shapes as well, creatures whose lineages would persist in different forms or vanish entirely from the geological record. The slow drift of continental plates was reshaping the distribution of land and water, pushing the shallow seas that supported one kind of life into deeper configurations that supported entirely different kinds, Pokémon adapted or they did not. The ones that did would eventually lead to recognizable descendants. The ones that did not left only their outlines in stone, patient signatures written in compressed sediment, waiting for a future they could never have imagined. 2 million years before the games that players hold in their hands, something happened in the region that would eventually be called Paldea. A great crater formed, an impact that reshaped the landscape dramatically and created a feature that would define the region's geography for all the time that followed. The crater became Area Zero, and within its depths a strange microclimate developed, sheltered from the outside world, preserving within it an environment unlike anything else in the region. Almost all of the paradox Pokémon that had inhabited the area were wiped out in this event. Only one survived, and it survived by doing something that no other creature had been recorded doing. It turned its body into crystal. The crystal survivor waited. 1 million years passed. The crater deepened with geological time. The walls grew steeper. The microclimate within became more isolated and more strange. And in that depth and strangeness, Terrapagos persisted, holding the shape it had chosen when the world had tried to end it, waiting for a time when the circumstances outside might once again become navigable. Patience at that scale is not a quality that maps easily onto the shorter rhythms of creature life. It suggests something closer to stone than to biology, a stillness so complete that time itself becomes irrelevant. 20,000 years before the events that players eventually experience, a meteor arrived in the region of Galar. It was not simply a rock from space. Arceus had been residing within it, dormant across the long ages, carried through the void between stars in a state of suspension that resembles sleep more than it resembles anything else. The meteor settled into the earth, and Arceus remained within it, patient, unreachable, neither guiding nor interfering with what was unfolding above it. The Galarian people would eventually layer their own stories over this fact, building myths and histories that circled the truth without quite landing on it, as mythology so often does. 10,000 years before the games, the three Regis were sealed. Regirock, Regis, and Registeel had been worshipped by human communities across multiple regions for thousands of years before something shifted in the relationship between those humans and the enormous beings they had venerated. The precise reasons for the sealing are unclear. The historical accounts that survive into the game era are fragmented, incomplete, shaped by the fact that written language was not yet reliable enough to preserve the nuance of what happened. What remains is the bare fact. Humans decided to seal away something they had revered, and the echo of that decision lingered in the landscape for millennia. Regigigas had come before all of them. The accounts of Regigigas describe it shaping the continents themselves, moving land masses across the face of the planet as if rearranging furniture, bombing several regions into new configurations, and raising the great mountain range that would eventually be called Mount Coronet. In the process, it created the 5 golems in its own image, smaller expressions of its particular kind of power. The Regis carry within their bodies the materials of the world. Regirock is stone. Regis is ancient ice. Registeel is metal. Regidrago and Regileki came later, shaped from the essence of dragon energy and lightning. Each one is a different answer to the question of what it means to be a creature made of the world's raw materials. There is something that asks to be noticed in the way the Regis were sealed rather than destroyed. The humans who chose to contain them clearly believed the sealing was reversible, that under different circumstances, with different knowledge, someone might eventually unseal what had been hidden. They left clues, puzzles encoded in the landscape, challenges that had to be solved before the seals would open. Whether they expected those challenges to be solved in 10,000 years or in 100,000, they clearly believed the world they were protecting the seals for would still be there, still inhabited, still capable of using what lay beneath. Long before the events of Pokémon legends, Arceus, an ancient hero, walked through the landscape of what would become Hisui. The accounts of this figure are more mythological than historical, preserved in the stories of the Diamond and Pearl clans, and in the architecture of the temples and shrines that dot the region's more remote corners. This hero was known, in the deep past, as someone who had collected all of Arceus's legendary plates, who had befriended rather than battled the Pokémon they encountered, and who had eventually faced Arceus itself in a meeting that most accounts describe as a confrontation resolved through mutual recognition rather than victory or defeat. Arceus, the story says, granted the descendants of the hero's Pokémon special powers. These would become the noble Pokémon, the ancient wardens whose care passed from generation to generation of the clans. The Diamond and Pearl clans themselves came to Hisui from the region of Sinnoh, carrying with them the culture of the Celestica people and eventually merging with it, taking the name as their own despite the geographic distance from the original Celestica homeland. The trails and ruins and temples the Celestica had built remained in the landscape as the clans settled into their territories, creating a layered archaeology that players who eventually walk those routes can sense without always being able to articulate. Something old is here, the landscape seems to say. Something passed through before you and left its marks. 3,000 years before the main series games, the Kalos War tore through its region with the particular thoroughness of a conflict that has decided it will not end until there is no one left who remembers what it felt like before the fighting began. Thousands of Pokémon and people died. Among the dead was Floette, the companion of the king known as Aziz, a small creature whose loss broke something in the king that would never fully mend. Aziz's response to that grief was to build a machine. The machine ran on what the records call infinity energy, a power source whose exact nature was never fully explained, but whose effects were not ambiguous. The machine could resurrect the dead. Azel used it to bring Floette back. He gave Floette eternal life, and in doing so, gave himself the same gift without having asked for it or having thought carefully enough about what it would mean to carry centuries without the option of setting them down. The war was still happening. Aziz still had a machine that could convert life force into power. The next step in his reasoning, the step that would define how history remembered him, was to turn the machine toward ending the war rather than simply mourning within it. He pointed the machine at the battlefield and activated it, and the war ended, and countless living things who had not chosen to become fuel for someone else's resolution were converted into the energy that bought the silence. Floette watched this happen and fled. Azid, suddenly immortal and alone, began the long wandering through the centuries that would eventually bring him to a chance meeting with a young trainer 3,000 years later. The machine was buried. Aziz's brother, recognizing what it represented, hid it deep enough that it could not easily be found or reactivated. The machine is called the ultimate weapon, and the crater it eventually leaves in the landscape of Kalos has its own geological presence, a feature that exists alongside rivers and mountain ranges and shorelines as if it were simply another natural thing. It is not a natural thing. It is the preserved consequence of a king's grief and a mathematician's calculation about acceptable costs. The ground above it held its silence for 3,000 years. Also around this time, in Galar, a darkness arrived that would be remembered as the Darkest Day. Eternatus, a cosmic Pokémon that had arrived in Galar on a meteor long before, released an enormous surge of energy from within the earth. Wild Pokémon across the region Dynamaxed and Gigantamaxed without warning, their bodies swelling to enormous sizes, their power multiplying beyond anything a trainer could safely manage. The crisis was immense, chaotic, and seemed to have no obvious resolution until two heroes appeared alongside the legendary wolves, Zacian and Zamazenta. Those heroes defeated Eternatus, They sealed it away deep within energy plant, contained within a structure that would not be discovered for thousands of years. The heroes became the first kings of Galar, celebrated figures whose triumph would eventually fade into the kind of myth that loses its specificity over centuries. By the time the events of Pokémon Sword and Shield occurred, almost no one alive could accurately describe what had happened or who those heroes had been. The wolves themselves remembered, carrying the memory in the shape of their forms and in the weight of the crowns and shields they bore. But wolves cannot give testimony in the way that written records can, and written records from 3,000 years ago have a way of becoming illegible to the people who eventually find them. 2,000 years before the events of the main games, the Hoenn region was under siege from the sky. Meteors fell repeatedly across the region, each impact reshaping the landscape, each impact carrying within it the compressed energy of the space between stars. One of those impacts wiped out the homeland of the Draconid people entirely. The ruins they had built and the culture they had developed were buried under the material that fell from above, and Meteor Falls exists today as a geological monument to that loss, its caves carved by the force of impact, and its water carrying the particular stillness of places where something important ended. The energy the meteors brought with them did something else, something that was almost worse than the destruction. It woke Kyogre and Groudon. The two super ancient Pokémon had been sleeping since their first great battle in the even older past, the battle in which Rayquaza had descended and silenced them both. But the meteor energy called to them in some way that sleep could not block, and they rose again, and the fighting between them resumed, and the people of Hoenn found themselves caught between two forces of geological scale that had no particular interest in what the humans below them were building or losing. The Draconid people made a wish. The exact language of that wish is not preserved, but its substance is. They asked Rayquaza to come. And Rayquaza heard and descended and silenced the great battle again, and the Draconids, grateful in the way that survivors of catastrophe often are, began to worship the Sky Serpent as a protector and a guardian. The Sky Pillar was eventually built as a tribute, a structure tall enough to feel like a gesture toward the creature that lived above the clouds, a thank you written in stone that could be read from very far away. The prophecy was recorded in that same period. The Draconids understood that what had happened once could happen again, and they wrote down their understanding that another meteor would come in approximately 1,000 years, and they charged themselves and their descendants with preparing for that moment, with preserving the knowledge that Rayquaza could be called, that the ancient rivalry could be quieted rather than simply survived. The prophecy was passed forward, generation to generation, a burden that looked like heritage, a duty that felt like a gift. 1,000 years before the games, Arceus planted a tree. The accounts of this are sparse, almost matter-of-fact in their brevity. Azay was in Hoenn. Arceus placed a tree outside the Cave of Origin. Close to that same period, another meteor arrived, hitting the region and forming the crater of what is now Sootopolis City. Kyogre and Groudon awoke again, as the prophecy had suggested they would. The people of Hoenn called on Rayquaza again, but this time the circumstances were different. This time, Rayquaza absorbed the meteor's power directly, and in doing so, achieved something that would change the fundamental understanding of what Pokémon could become. Rayquaza performed the first Mega Evolution. The form that resulted was not simply a stronger version of Rayquaza. It was something that transcended what Rayquaza had been before, a temporary ascension into a more complete expression of its nature. Rayquaza, in its mega form, defeated both Kyogre and Groudon in the same encounter, stripping away their primal reversions and sending them back into their deep sleep. The Sky Pillar stood as testament. The crater of Sootopolis held its shape as geography, and the understanding of mega-evolution began to spread through the region in quiet ways, encoded in keystones and megastones and in the bloodlines of Pokémon that carried the capacity for that kind of transformation. 805 years before the games, the Nanab and Oran berries were recorded in Mesoa, in Paldea. The precision of this date suggests that someone was keeping records carefully enough to note the exact year of a horticultural discovery, which implies a level of institutional knowledge that had been developing for some time by then. The Nana berry is among the mildest and most widely distributed in the Pokémon world, a small thing, round and soft, nutritious in the way that something simple and plentiful can be nutritious without being spectacular. But the record of its cultivation is a record of humans domesticating the landscape around them, deciding that what grew wild could be tended and improved and distributed. 800 years before the games, the events that define the Hisui era were beginning to unfold. The Galaxy Expedition Team had arrived from a distant region, establishing the settlement that would become Jubilife Village, making first contact with the Diamond and Pearl clans, who already inhabited the landscape, and beginning the slow process of negotiation and tension and eventual accommodation that defines the relationship between established communities and arriving ones. The Hisui that players experience in Pokémon Legends. Arceus is a particular moment in this negotiation, already past its most difficult early confrontations, already developing the institutional structures that would eventually allow the clans and the expedition team to coexist. Professor Laventon is cataloging Pokémon with a seriousness that suggests the endeavor matters beyond mere record-keeping. Commander Kamato is building governance structures. The wardens of each noble Pokémon are maintaining their ancient responsibilities. The Pokédex is being assembled for the first time, a project that feels modest in scope, but contains within it the conceptual framework that will define how humans relate to Pokémon for the next several centuries. The nobles themselves are worth dwelling on. Each one is a Pokémon of unusual power, descended in some lineage from the companions of the ancient hero, carriers of a grace that marks them as distinct from the Pokémon around them. Cleavor, Lilligant, Arcanine, Electrode, and Avalugg each guard a different corner of the Hisui region, each one tended by a warden who has inherited the responsibility through family or tradition. When the space-time rift opens above Mount Coronet, and the Pokémon of Hisui begin to act erratically, falling into states of frenzy that make them unapproachable and dangerous, the nobles are among the first and most dramatically affected. The rifts bring back something from outside ordinary time. The player who arrives in Hisui is not from Hisui at all, having fallen through a temporal distortion into a past that should be inaccessible, and then drawn into the investigation of what is causing the rifts while simultaneously navigating the cultural challenges of arriving in a place where their own existence is inexplicable. The eventual discovery that Volo, one of the characters who helps the player throughout their journey, has been deliberately working to recreate the conditions needed to awaken Arceus, adds a particular weight to everything that has already happened. Good help is not always helping for the reasons it claims. The ancient Sinnoh mythology, the Diamond and Pearl clans' competing interpretations of Arceus and Palkia and Dialga, the inscriptions on the stone tablets that dot the landscape of Hisui, all of these are pieces of a story that fits together when you hold them all at once and step back far enough to see the shape they make. The player does that eventually. The encounter with Arceus at the top of Mount Coronet is not a battle in the conventional sense. It is a recognition, a moment in which the creator of everything and a traveler from outside ordinary time look at each other across the space that separates their natures and find something to agree about. 500 years before the main series games, The foundations of what would become the major modern cities of Sinnoh were being established. Eterna City carries within its name and architecture a memory of how old it is. The stone of its buildings worn smooth by a duration that newer settlements have not yet achieved. The Eterna Forest holds within it an old chateau that dates to a period several generations before the events of Diamond and Pearl, a structure whose history layers ghost-type Pokémon appearances with the records of a family that once lived there, worked there, and eventually stopped being present without their absence being adequately explained. The ruins scattered across multiple regions speak to an even older pattern of settlement and abandonment. Pokémon ruins are rarely simply ruins. They are conversations with time, structures built with intent, and then released from that intent when the people who built them moved or ended. The ruins near Solacion town encode the unknown alphabet in their carved surfaces. The ruins of the Regi temples encode a different kind of challenge, one that requires a trainer to understand not just the location, but the method of approach, to demonstrate knowledge before being permitted to proceed. Ruins in the Pokémon world function as memory made physical. They are what persists when the communities that created them do not. Walking through the ruins of Alph in Johto, or the sealed chamber in Hoenn, or the desert ruins that hold Regirock, a player is walking through stratified time, passing through layers of history that are visible in the architecture and the inscriptions even when the precise historical narrative has been lost. The Pokémon world is full of these moments, places where the past is present in a way that does not require understanding to be felt. About 300 years before the primary game events, the sea charts and navigation traditions of Hoenn were being formalized, creating the infrastructure that eventually allows ocean travel to become routine rather than exceptional. Slateport City's role as a port emerges from this period, its identity as a trading hub shaped by the accumulated decisions of generations of sailors and merchants who understood that certain geographic positions are simply better for certain kinds of activity. The currents run differently here. The harbor sits at the right angle. These are the kinds of calculations that become tradition, then become identity, then become the personality of a place that new arrivals experience as simply the way things are. The relationship between Pokémon and human economies across these centuries is not always foregrounded in the games, but it shapes everything. Pokémon have been partners in agriculture, in construction, in transportation, in fishing, in exploration. The settlements that became towns, that became cities, each carry within their geography the evidence of which Pokémon made their development possible. Machamp's strength, Lapras's willingness to carry passengers across deep water, Rapidash's speed on land routes. The symbiosis between human settlement patterns and the Pokémon that inhabited the same landscapes created the world that players navigate, even though the explicit evidence of that history is distributed across thousands of small details that are easy to walk past without noticing. 200 years before the events of the games, the great Pokémon Professor lineage was establishing itself in Pallet Town in the region of Kanto. The tradition of regional professors, specialists who dedicate their careers to the systematic study of Pokémon, did not emerge fully formed. It developed across generations of naturalists and researchers, each one building on what the previous generation had documented, each one finding the questions that the previous answers had opened up. Professor Oak's grandfather was studying Pokémon in Pallet Town at the same time that the lineage of the Pokémon League itself was being formalized in Kanto, creating parallel institutions that would eventually come to define how the region understood its relationship with the creatures it shared its landscape with. The Pokémon League, as a formal institution, has its roots in older traditions of individual champions and regional battles, but the systematized structure, the gyms, and the Elite Four and the Champion, was assembled deliberately by people who believed that channeling the desire for competition into structured forms would serve both the competitive participants and the regions they inhabited. The Kanto League is among the oldest in this formalized sense, its gym leaders representing the diversity of type specialization that the league system eventually standardized across regions. The concept of gym specialization deserves a moment of attention because it contains within it a philosophy about expertise and the value of depth over breadth. A gym leader who has spent decades working exclusively with water-type Pokémon develops an understanding of those Pokémon's potential that no generalist could match. The team compositions, the battle strategies, the bond between a specialist and their partners, all of it is shaped by a commitment that has accumulated over years. When a young trainer challenges a gym leader, they are not simply testing their own strength. They are measuring themselves against the concentrated weight of a specialist's lifetime. 100 years before the events of Pokémon Gold and Silver, the Slowpoke Well in Azalea Town was under the care of the community that would eventually develop into the town itself. The relationship between Azalea Town and Slowpoke is one of the more quietly touching of the many human and Pokémon relationships embedded in the world's geography. Slowpoke shed their tails in the well as a matter of natural biology, and the townspeople gathered those discarded tails, which had a sweetness valued as a local delicacy, and a tradition of mutual accommodation developed that persisted across generations. The well became a sacred space, and the Slowpoke became central to the town's cultural identity. And when Team Rocket eventually arrived and began harvesting Slowpoke tails by force, the violation was not only economic but deeply cultural, an attack on the form of reciprocity that had shaped Azalea Town for a century. The Ilex Forest that separates Azalea Town from Goldenrod City holds its own history in a different register. Celebi moves through time within that forest, according to the mythology associated with it, leaving behind only the faintest traces of its passage, occasionally encountered by those who arrive at exactly the right moment, with exactly the right combination of items. The forest is old enough that the trees have the particular quality of old things, the sense of having been standing long enough to have witnessed the passage of enough events that individual human dramas seem small within the larger context. The shrine at the forest's heart marks a particular relationship between the forest and the community that has always lived alongside it, a recognition that certain places require acknowledgement. 60 years before the events of Pokémon Red and Blue, Giovanni was born in Viridian City. The circumstances of his early life are not extensively documented in the games themselves, but the trajectory from Viridian City to the founding of Team Rocket and eventually to the dual role of gym leader and criminal organization leader is one of the more complex character arcs in the franchise's history. Giovanni's understanding of Pokémon power is genuine and sophisticated. His willingness to exploit that power, to treat Pokémon as weapons and commodities rather than partners, represents a fundamental philosophical position about the relationship between strength and ethics that the games engage with directly rather than simply asserting one answer. The founding of Team Rocket itself was an organizational act that required significant resources, significant recruitment, and significant charisma. The grunts and administrators who eventually filled the organization's ranks were drawn to it for various reasons, some ideological, some economic, some simply because belonging to a powerful organization is itself a form of power for people who have never had much of it. Team Rocket, at its height, was not simply a criminal enterprise, but a system with hierarchies and loyalties and internal cultures, and Giovanni's genius was partly in creating something cohesive enough to function across multiple regions, while remaining centralized enough to be recognizable as a single entity. 50 years before the events of Pokémon Red and Blue, Professor Oak was beginning his own Pokémon journey. The details of what Oak encountered and achieved during his own trainer years are scattered across the games in brief references, But what is clear is that his experience as a trainer shaped the kind of researcher he became. The empathy he demonstrates toward young trainers who are beginning their own journeys is the empathy of someone who remembers clearly what it felt like to stand at the beginning of a route without certainty about what the next town would hold. His relationship with the Pokédex as a tool of connection, rather than simply a tool of classification, reflects someone who has held Pokeballs and understood what they contain. Oak's rivalry with Agatha during their trainer years is documented in passing conversations, a suggestion that the battles between them were significant enough to leave long impressions on both sides. Agatha, who eventually became one of Kanto's Elite Four specialists in Ghost-type Pokémon, maintained a particular kind of contempt for what she saw as Oak's retreat from battling into research. The ghost of that rivalry haunts the brief conversation a player can have with her in the Pokémon Tower of Lavender Town, one of those moments where the games embed character depth into a few lines of dialogue that would be easy to read past quickly. Lavender Town itself deserves consideration as one of the more quietly significant locations in the Kanto region. The Pokémon Tower was built as a burial place for Pokémon, a recognition that creatures who had lived alongside humans and formed bonds with them deserved specific spaces for mourning and commemoration. The ghost-type Pokémon that inhabit its upper floors are not hostile in any simple way. They are presences, the way that places associated with significant loss often feel inhabited by something that is not quite absence and not quite presence. Mr. Fuji, the elderly gentleman who lives in Lavender Town and dedicates his time to caring for abandoned or orphaned Pokémon, embodies the town's particular quality of tending carefully to what others have let go. 20 years before the events of Pokémon Red and Blue, the legendary birds were establishing the territorial patterns that players eventually navigate around. Articuno in the northern reaches of the Seafoam Islands, Zapdos in the power plant along the river east of Cerulean City, Moltres in Victory Road near the Pokémon League. Each location carries the particular quality of the legendary IT hosts, not simply as habitat but as atmosphere. The Seafoam Islands have the cold grandeur of something that has been carved by time and ice into its current form. The power plant has the particular silence of a machine that has stopped, a human structure abandoned to something that neither made it nor needed it. The Lake of Rage in the Johto region already held Gyarados long before the events of Gold and Silver, the great red Gyarados that eventually appears there being an anomaly produced by Team Rocket's forced evolution experiments rather than a natural feature of the lake. The ordinary Gyarados that moved through Johto's waterways were simply part of the landscape, the way that powerful things can become part of a landscape when they have been there long enough. Fishermen who worked the rivers and lakes of Johto developed their own relationship with the local Magikarp populations, understanding the developmental trajectory of a creature that appears useless and becomes extraordinary, patient with the process in the way that experience teaches patience. The Safari Zone south of Fuchsia City in Kanto was established as a conservation area, a space where Pokémon could be encountered in conditions closer to wild than the training environments of the rest of the root system. The idea behind it, that certain Pokémon benefit from spaces where human competitive interests are managed and constrained, reflects a conservation philosophy that the Pokémon world has developed in ways that parallel the real world's own conversations about wildlife management and protected areas. The warden, who runs the Fuchsia Safari Zone, is a figure of some comic dimension in the original games, but the institution he administers represents something genuinely thoughtful about the relationship between human activity and Pokémon habitats. 15 years before Red and Blue, the conditions that would eventually lead to the events of the games were quietly accumulating. Team Rocket was expanding its operations. The Pokémon League was continuing to develop its institutional structures. Professors in each region were adding to the accumulated body of Pokémon research. And in Pallet Town, two children were growing up in adjacent houses, neither one yet aware that their parallel development would eventually define the most famous Pokémon journey in the franchise's narrative history. Red and Blue, or Red and Green in the original Japanese release, are the protagonists of a story that has been revisited, referenced, and reframed so many times across the decades of the franchise's existence that it can be easy to forget how straightforwardly it begins. A 10-year-old child walks through tall grass. A professor gives them a Pokémon. A rival appears. A journey begins. The simplicity of this structure is not an oversight or a limitation. It is a design choice, a recognition that the beginning of an adventure should feel accessible, should feel like something anyone could step into, should not require extensive prior knowledge to engage with. The 8 gyms of Kanto, the Elite Four, and the Champion were not assembled randomly. Each gym leader was selected based on their expertise, their character, and their ability to provide a meaningful challenge to young trainers, while also genuinely educating them about the particular type they specialize in. Brock's rock-type mastery reflects a connection to the geological permanence of Pewter City and the fossils displayed in its museum. Misty's water-type expertise reflects Cerulean City's position near the rivers that feed into the Pokémon League's geography. Each specialist is a product of their place, shaped by the landscape they have spent their lives within. The encounter with Mewtwo at the end of Cerulean Cave is not simply a high-level battle opportunity. It is the conclusion of a story that began in the Pokémon Mansion on Cinnabar Island, in the research journals left behind by scientists who had worked with Mew's genetic material and had created something they had not fully understood the consequences of creating. Mewtwo's existence is the result of scientific ambition working beyond the bounds of ethical consideration, and the creature that resulted carries within its extraordinary power the particular isolation of a being that was created rather than born, that came into existence through human decisions, and has never quite known what to do with that fact. The Kanto journey concludes with the defeat of the Elite Four and the Champion, but the world of Kanto does not conclude with it. The events of Pokémon Fire Red and Leaf Green add dimensions to the original narrative, including the Sevii Islands, a chain of islands south of Kanto that carry their own ecological and historical complexity. The ancient ruins on Seven Island hint at a civilization that predates the current Kanto settlements by several generations, and the Pokémon that inhabit the islands include species that do not appear in the main Kanto region, suggesting a history of geographic isolation that has allowed different evolutionary trajectories. The legendary birds and their connections to the legendary beasts of Johto, the shared elements between Kanto's ancient mythology and Johto's, reflect the geographic proximity of the two regions and the long history of cultural exchange between them. Kanto and Johto are different places with different personalities, but they share a border and a history, and the deep past of each region is tangled up with the deep past of the other in ways that neither region's contemporary culture fully acknowledges. Johto's particular character, its emphasis on tradition and ceremony, its reverence for the old ways of relating to Pokémon, its architecture that retains design elements from periods when the relationship between humans and Pokémon was understood and practiced differently. All of this reflects a community that has made deliberate choices about what it wants to carry forward from its history and what it wants to let go of. Ecruteak City is the most concentrated expression of Johto's historical character, a place where the Tin Tower and the Burned Tower stand as monuments to a relationship between humans and legendary Pokémon that was disrupted by catastrophe and never fully restored. The Tin Tower and the Burned Tower carry between them the story of Ho-Oh and Lugia, and of the 3 Pokémon who died in the fire and were reborn as the legendary beasts. The Tower of the Brass, or Tin Tower, was built to commemorate the relationship between humans and Ho-Oh, a relationship of reciprocal trust that required the humans to build a space worthy of a legendary's presence and to maintain it with consistent care. When the brass tower burned, whether through accident or the particular carelessness of people who had stopped taking the relationship as seriously as their ancestors had, Ho-Oh departed. It has not returned to the tower in the centuries since. Lugia retreated to the depths of the Whirl Islands in the aftermath of the fire. The connection between the two legendaries, Ho-Oh above and Lugia below, reflects a complementary relationship between sky and sea, between the warmth of fire and the coolness of water, between the rainbow and the storm. The games that bear their names, Gold and Silver and Crystal, hold them in productive tension, suggesting that the world is more complete when both are present in it than when one or the other is absent. The legendary beasts, Raikou, Entei, and Suicune, were the three Pokémon who perished in the burned tower fire. Their resurrection by Ho-Oh gave them forms shaped by the nature of their deaths and by the qualities Ho-Oh imbued them with in bringing them back. Raikou was struck by lightning during the fire, and its form carries the electrical power of that moment. Entei arose from the flames, and its form contains the concentrated force of fire held permanently present. Suicune was extinguished by the rain that eventually fell, and its form carries the purifying quality of water at its most healing. They scatter across Johto in the games, running rather than waiting, available to be encountered but not easily contained, creatures of the open landscape rather than fixed locations. The three towers of Johto, the Tin Tower, the Sprout Tower, and the ruins that connect to them, speak to a culture that built vertically when it wanted to express devotion, that chose height as a way of reaching toward the things it valued. The monks of the Sprout Tower have maintained their tradition for long enough that the tradition feels simply like the nature of the place, rather than a choice that someone made at some specific moment in the past. The swaying pillar at the tower's center, cut from a single piece of wood, demonstrates a philosophy of material integrity that has its own quiet eloquence. The craftspeople who built it were not simply constructing a building. They were making a statement about how much could be expressed through the most direct possible means. The radio tower in Goldenrod City represents the technological counterpoint to Johto's more ceremonial architecture. The city itself is the most urban environment in the region, its department store and game corner and train station suggesting a level of commercial activity that the smaller towns and more rural routes do not aspire to. Goldenrod is where Johto's economy concentrates itself, where the flows of trade and communication and cultural production come together in a density that the region's other settlements are content to witness at a distance. The radio tower broadcasts across the entire region, and Team Rocket's eventual takeover of it in gold and silver is a strike at the network of connection that binds Johto's dispersed communities into something recognizable as a shared world. The national park north of Goldenrod holds its own kind of significance. The bug catching contest that takes place there on specific days is not simply a recreational event. It is an expression of the relationship between human appreciation and wild Pokémon habitat, a structured encounter that acknowledges the park as a shared space rather than a managed resource. The park's rules, the time limit, the single Pokémon allowed for capture, create a framework that privileges experience over acquisition, that asks participants to engage with the wild space on terms that the wild space can absorb without being diminished by the engagement. The ice path connecting Mahogany Town to Blackthorn City carries the particular quality of landscapes that human passage does not dominate. The ice underfoot shifts with temperature changes that have nothing to do with the preferences of the travelers crossing it. The Pokémon that inhabit it, the The swinub and jinx and delibird have adapted to conditions that require specific solutions to specific survival problems, and their adaptations are visible in their forms in ways that feel genuinely ecological rather than simply aesthetic. The Dragon's Den beneath Blackthorn City is among the more resonant locations in Johto, a place where the formality of the dragon-type specialist tradition meets the wildness of water and cave, where a master of dragon Pokémon tests not strength, but understanding, asking questions that have no tactical answer, that require something more like wisdom than calculation. Claire, the gym leader of Blackthorn City, and a member of the dragon-type tradition that produces both a lance of the Elite Four and the lineage of dragon tamers associated with the den, represents a particular kind of pride that is inseparable from a particular kind of skill. Dragon Pokémon have traditionally required experienced trainers, the friendship mechanisms that enable evolution in several dragon types, reflecting a genuine demand that the trainer demonstrate sustained investment rather than simply meeting a level threshold. Dragonite, Salamence, Garchomp, each of them asks something of the trainer that goes beyond raw competitive strategy. Lance himself, as the champion of Kanto's Elite Four, who appears in Johto's narrative as a kind of special operative investigating the Lake of Rage, is one of the franchise's more interesting recurring figures. His public role as champion sits in deliberate tension with the more active interventionist role he takes in investigating Team Rocket's operations, suggesting a character who understands that formal authority and effective action are not always the same thing. The Hoenn region that players experience in Ruby and Sapphire and Emerald carries the geological freshness of a landscape that is still being shaped by the forces beneath it. Volcanoes are not ancient history in Hoenn. They are ongoing processes. The Route 112 cable car that leads to the top of Mount Chimney takes players past the still active remnants of geological forces that have not finished their work. Lava Ridge Town at the mountain's base built its identity around the hot springs that the volcanic activity makes possible, channeling something potentially destructive into a form that the community can use and value. Stephen Stone's relationship with stones and rare materials reflects Hoenn's geological character in a way that makes him one of the more thematically coherent champions in the franchise. His father runs the Devon Corporation, which processes and applies rare geological materials from across the region, and Stephen's personal interest in collecting unusual stones is a hobby that connects to his region's fundamental nature in a way that feels less like coincidence than like someone who grew up deeply aware of what the landscape beneath him was made of. His Metagross, the steel and psychic type pseudo-legendary that serves as his signature partner, is itself a geological metaphor formed from the fusion of multiple smaller beings into a unified metallic whole. Team Magma and Team Aqua represent competing visions for what Hoenn should be, what the world should be, each one anchored in a partial understanding of the region's actual geological and ecological situation. Team Magma wants more land, believing that expanding the continental surface will benefit humanity and the terrestrial Pokémon that depend on land. Team Aqua wants more ocean, believing that expanding the seas will restore what has been lost from the world's ecological balance. Both organizations are built on genuine beliefs rather than simple greed, which makes them more interesting than organizations that are simply criminal enterprises, and which makes their eventual confrontation with each other and with the consequences of their own plans more genuinely troubling. The Pokémon contests that appear in Hoenn, alongside the Gym Challenge, represent an alternative vision of what it means to form a deep partnership with a Pokémon. Where the Gym Challenge asks for power and tactical intelligence, the contest system asks for beauty, for cleverness, for toughness, for cuteness, for coolness. Each category of contest asks trainers to demonstrate a different quality in their Pokemon's performance, and the Pokeblocks that enhance a Pokemon's contest attributes require collaboration and craft in their preparation. A trainer who excels in contests has developed a relationship with their Pokemon that emphasizes appreciation and presentation alongside competitive strength, and the world of Hoenn is large enough to honor both. The abandoned ship southeast of Dewford Town holds within it the history of a sea disaster, and the Pokemon that have made their homes in its flooded and rusted interior have adapted to the particular conditions that a deteriorating human structure provides. The ship is a reminder that the sea roots of Hoenn, for all their beauty and adventure, have also been the site of losses. The treasures recoverable in the ship's interior are not simply items with mechanical value. They are artifacts of interrupted journeys, belongings left behind by people who did not complete what they had set out to do. The Regis in Hoenn are sealed in 3 temples, whose locations must be deciphered from the sealed chamber, accessible only through diving south of Route 134. The puzzle of their locations is itself a philosophical statement. The knowledge of where something is sealed is accessible only to those willing to descend beneath the surface and read carefully. The Braille inscriptions that guide the player through the unsealing sequence are a detail that rewards patience, that asks the player to read rather than simply to press forward, that treats the act of paying careful attention as a skill worth exercising. The Sinnoh region's geography is dominated by Mount Coronet, the great mountain range that divides the region into its eastern and western halves, and that connects at its peak to the Spear Pillar, the platform where Dialga and Palkia can be encountered in Diamond and Pearl, respectively. The mountain is not simply terrain. It is an axis, the literal center point around which the region's history and mythology have organized themselves, the place toward which the most significant events have repeatedly converged. Cynthia, the champion of Sinnoh, carries the region's mythology in a way that no other champion quite matches. Her family has maintained a scholarly relationship with the mythology of the Creation Trio and with the ancient inscriptions of Sinnoh for multiple generations. Her grandmother in Celestic Town guards the shrine that commemorates Sinnoh's mythological origin. Cynthia herself has traveled to multiple regions in search of historical and mythological information, appearing in Sinnoh, Unova, Johto, and Kalos over the course of the games, always pursuing the same project of understanding the deep history of the Pokémon world. Her Garchomp is among the most famous partner Pokémon of any champion, its speed and power representing one of the franchise's clearest expressions of the dragon type's overwhelming physical capacity. The battle against Cynthia is routinely cited by players as among the most memorable and most challenging in the series, not simply because of Garchomp's statistical superiority, but because the encounter feels earned, feels like a meeting with someone who has done the work that deserves to produce that level of skill. The distortion world that players enter to rescue the gym leader. Cyrus has betrayed and retrieved the stolen legendaries is one of the most conceptually striking environments in the games. Gravity functions differently there. Platforms must be reached by walking in directions that the ordinary landscape does not permit. The rules of the ordinary world have been suspended in favor of a different set of rules, and Giratina moves through this space with an ease that makes the player's disorientation a useful contrast, a reminder that what is native to a place is oriented to the place's actual conditions rather than to the expectations of visitors. Unova's geographical distance from Kanto and Johto and Sinnoh is not coincidental. The region is based on New York in its structure and visual sensibility, urban and dense, and marked by the particular quality of a place where many different communities live in close proximity. The variety of Pokémon that inhabit Unova at the start of Black and White is managed carefully, with an encounter distribution that restricts players to new Unova Pokémon until the Postgame, a design choice that communicates something about Unova's sense of its own distinct identity. N, the central figure of Black and White's narrative, represents the franchise's most extended engagement with questions about what Pokémon are and what they want, and what the relationship between humans and Pokémon should be built upon. His childhood, raised in isolation by Getsis among only Pokémon, shaped an understanding of Pokémon communication and emotion that is genuine and unusual, a capacity for connection that most human trainers do not develop because they were not formed by the conditions that produce it. His goal of separating Pokémon from humans comes from a real place of concern for Pokémon well-being, even though the conclusion he draws from his concern is wrong in ways that the player's journey helps to demonstrate. The 7 sages of Team Plasma each represent a different philosophical position about the relationship between humans and Pokémon, assembled around Getsis's actual goal of controlling Pokémon without the constraint of partnership. The organization is a study in how genuine idealism can be exploited by people whose goals are less idealistic, how a movement built around real ethical concerns can be captured by someone who does not share those concerns, but understands how to direct the energy they generate. Kalos carries within its landscape the weight of the Kalos War's 3,000-year aftermath. The Pokémon Village is tucked away in a corner of the region, accessible only late in the game, is a place where Pokémon who have been abandoned by their trainers have gathered, and the fact that such a place exists and has developed its own quiet community speaks to the reality that the bond between a Pokémon and a trainer is not always maintained, that some Pokémon find themselves released or forgotten and must build something new from what remains. The player's encounter with the Pokémon there asks for respect rather than battle, for acknowledgement of the cost that the failure of care imposes on those left behind. Mega Evolution's introduction in Kalos connects to the mythology of the Keystone and the Megastone, materials that carry within them the compressed power of the bond between a Pokémon and a trainer who have developed something deep enough to temporarily transform both of them. The relationship between Mega Evolution and the events at the Cave of Origin, Rayquaza's first Mega Evolution at the cost of its meteor, suggests that the mechanism was always present in the world's design, waiting for the conditions that would allow it to be expressed. A Zed appears at the end of the Kalos narrative, 3,000 years older than when the war ended, still searching for Floette, finally reunited with the companion whose loss had set everything else in motion. The reunion is not triumphant. It is quiet, almost unbearably small in scale given what preceded it. 3,000 years of wandering, of guilt, of immortality worn as burden rather than gift, resolves into a single small moment of recognition. Floette returns. The machine's consequence, Az's immortality, lifts, and an old man who has been carrying 3,000 years of grief is allowed finally to set them down. Alola's relationship with its legendary Pokémon is intimate in a way that other regions' relationships with their legendaries are not quite. The Island Guardians, Tapu Koko, Tapu Lele, Tapu Bulu, and Tapu Fini, are not distant presences who must be sought out in remote locations. They inhabit the islands of Alola directly, visible aspects of the regions they protect, forces whose presence in the landscape is felt in the architecture of the shrines built for them, and in the traditions that have developed around the obligation to honor them appropriately. The trial system that replaces the gym challenge in Alola reflects a different cultural relationship with the process of becoming a skilled trainer, one rooted in the specific landscapes and Pokémon of each island rather than in generalized type specialization. The island Kahuna, who faces challengers at the end of each island's trials, is a figure of cultural authority as well as competitive skill, someone whose role in the community extends well beyond the battles they participate in. Hala in Melemele, Olivia in Akala, Nanu in Ula Ula, and Hapu in Pony each represent the full integration of Pokémon training into the fabric of their communities rather than its separation into a specialized competitive sphere. Ultra Space, the dimension from which the Ultra Beasts arrive, carries within its name and its visual presentation the quality of a place that has not been shaped by the same forces that shape the ordinary Pokémon world. The Ultra Beasts themselves, Nihilego and Buzzwole and Pheromosa and all the others, are not threatening in the way that Team Rocket or Team Galactic are threatening. They are simply other products of an ecology so different from the one the player has been trained to navigate that ordinary frameworks for understanding Pokémon do not quite apply to them. The Ether Foundation's attempts to contain and study them reflect a genuine scientific interest that is complicated by Lucamine's particular relationship with the Ultra Beasts, an obsession that the games treat with the seriousness it deserves. Galar's Dynamax phenomenon, the capacity for Pokémon to grow to enormous size during specific battles in specific locations, is tied directly to Eternatus and to the darkest day 3,000 years before. The Galar particle that enables Dynamaxing is produced by Eternatus's ongoing presence deep within the Earth, and the way Pokémon respond to it, filling the available space, expressing their power at a scale that overwhelms the normal, is a consequence of a crisis that the region's contemporary inhabitants do not fully understand because the historical records that would explain it have been lost. Leon's fame as the undefeated champion of Galar rests on a genuine record, a sustained excellence that has produced in the region a particular relationship with the idea of dominance, of holding a position so completely that the position begins to define you more than you define the position. His friendship with Rose, the businessman who controls the Macrocosmos Corporation and who believes that the energy crisis coming for Galar must be addressed by awakening Eternatus rather than wait it out, is a study in how affection can coexist with catastrophically different values. Zacian and Zamazenta, emerging from their long absence to address the crisis of Eternatus Awakened, is one of the franchise's more emotionally direct moments. The two wolves carry their weapons in ways that speak to a very long history of being exactly what a crisis requires, and their appearance in the contemporary era, after centuries of being absent from Galar's active mythology, has the quality of something returning that was always going to return when the time came, that had simply been waiting for the moment when it would be needed. Paldea's story, centered on the school structure of the Naranja and Uva academies, takes the franchise's usual emphasis on personal growth through Pokémon training and embeds it within an explicitly educational institution. The three paths that players pursue simultaneously, the victory road of gym challenges, the path of legends in pursuit of the Titan Pokémon, and the Starfall Street investigation of Team Star, each one asking a different question about what kind of trainer the player wants to become, what kind of relationships they want to build, what kind of community they want to be part of. The great crater of Paldea and Area Zero at its base form the geographical heart of Scarlet and Violet's most significant revelations. The paradox Pokémon that inhabit the crater, ancient forms of contemporary Pokémon, or future forms depending on the version, are a consequence of the time machine that Professor Sada or Professor Turo built in their research station at the crater's floor. The discovery that the professor is dead and has been replaced by an AI replica for the duration of the story reframes everything that preceded it. Every piece of advice and guidance given as the player descended toward this meeting, every expression of care and interest, now read differently in the knowledge that the care was genuine, but the person expressing it was not the person the player thought they were talking to. The future of the Pokémon timeline remains genuinely open. Legend, ZOA, the next announced major title in the series, is set in Lumiosa City in Kalos, focusing on an urban redevelopment project that will reshape the city. Where exactly it will fall on the established timeline is not yet known, but the Kalos setting brings with it the weight of everything that region has already been established to contain. The memory of the Kalos War, the presence of AZ's long shadow, the particular relationship between mega evolution and the geological features of the landscape. What the games have always done well is embed the specific within the general, finding in the story of a single trainer navigating a single region the patterns that repeat across all the regions and all the trainers and all the time that the timeline spans. A child begins a journey. They encounter Pokémon they did not know existed before that morning. They form bonds that change both the trainer and the Pokémon in ways that neither could have anticipated at the start. The world is larger at the end than it was at the beginning, not because the world changed, but because the person experiencing it did. The legendary Pokémon that anchor each region's deepest mythology are not simply powerful opponents for experienced trainers to challenge. They are repositories of the region's history, expressions in living form of the forces that shaped the landscape, the weather, the passage of time itself. Encountering one is an encounter with something that was already old when the region's oldest cities were young, something that has witnessed enough of the world's unfolding that it has become part of the world's unfolding rather than simply a participant in it. The weight of the Pokémon timeline, from the primordial egg through the cooling of ancient seas, through the wars and disasters, and slowly accumulated human settlements, and legendary encounters and scientific discoveries, and training philosophies and champion lineages, is not felt all at once in any single game. It is distributed across every game, every region, every character who carries a few lines of dialogue that reference something older than the story currently being told. The grandmother in Celestic Town who guards the shrine is part of the timeline. The old man in Pewter City who tells you to use repel in the grass is part of the timeline. The ruins accessible only after you have completed the main story and returned with stronger Pokémon are part of the timeline. This distributed depth is one of the franchise's most quietly impressive qualities. The timeline exists not as a thing that must be actively pursued, but as a quality that rewards those who pay attention, who read the signs in the cave walls, and the dialogue of the elderly characters, and the names of the berries, and the distribution of the fossils. The world has been here for a very long time, and it shows not loudly, but in the particular way that old things show their age without drawing attention to it. Arceus, resting somewhere in a state that is neither quite sleeping nor quite watching, contains within itself the original egg, the primordial void, the first moment of creation. Everything that followed, every Pokémon and every trainer and every battle and every bond, is an expression of what that egg contained when it first began to stir. The timeline is not a line at all. It is a great expansion outward from a single point, still expanding, still filling in the space that creation opened when it began. There are still things that the timeline does not explain. There are gaps that the games acknowledge without filling, mysteries that have been present since the first generation and have not been resolved across 30 years of editions. Where did Mew go? What exactly Arceus is beyond its status as creator? Whether the distortion world is truly sealed or simply separated, whether the Lake Guardian's gifts of knowledge, willpower, and emotion were the only gifts given or simply the ones recorded. These open questions are not failures of world building. They are features of it, spaces left deliberately or through the natural limitation of any ongoing creative project, places where the imagination of the player is invited to continue what the games have started. The Unknown in their alphabet chambers, suggest a language that predates anything currently spoken, a communication system so old that its original users are no longer traceable. The inscriptions at ruins of Alf and at the sealed chamber and at the various temples and shrines across all the regions are all pieces of a communication that was never meant to be decoded by the people who eventually found them. They were left for each other by people who believed in the continuity of their community across time, who assumed someone would still be there to read what they had written. The assumption was wrong, or at least it was partially wrong. The messages survived, but their intended readers did not. What remained was the letters themselves, held in stone, waiting for whoever came next. The patience required by stone is a different kind of patience than the patience required by ice or by water or by the slow movement of a living creature through the seasons of its life. Stone holds what is written in it without expectation, without preference for when or whether it will be read. The inscriptions on the walls of the ruins across all the Pokémon regions carry this quality, this radical indifference to timing that makes them available to any careful reader, regardless of when that reader arrives. In that sense, the deepest past of the Pokémon timeline is still accessible, still present, still waiting in the particular patience of stone for whoever comes next with enough attention to notice what has been written there. And so the timeline turns, slowly as it always has, from the primordial void to the hatching egg to the first great acts of creation, through the ancient seas and the fossilized creatures and the geological upheavals and the legendary battles and the slow accumulation of human culture and the transmission of knowledge across generations, down to the specific morning when a specific child woke up in a specific town and walked through the tall grass and found that the world was larger than they had known it to be. That specific morning has happened in every region, with every generation of players, and it will happen again. The timeline does not end with what has already been told. It continues, as all living things continue, forward into whatever comes next. There is a particular kind of attention that the Pokémon world rewards, the kind that does not rush from root to root, but instead pauses at the edge of a cliff to look down at the ocean far below and wonder what lives in the depth of it, what has always lived there, long before any trainer thought to cast a line into the water. The Pokémon world is built for this kind of attention. Every item description carries a fragment of history. Every Pokédex entry gestures toward a larger natural world that the game never fully shows, suggesting that what the player encounters is always only a portion of what exists. The world is deliberately incomplete in this way, deliberately larger than its maps can hold. The relationship between Pokédex entries and the actual Pokémon the player encounters is one of the franchise's most quietly interesting, ongoing negotiations. A Pokédex entry for Gengar states that it can lower the temperature of a room by 10 degrees simply by being present, that it hides in shadows and mimics the darkness cast by people and objects. But the Gengar that a player catches and trains and sends into battle does not lower the temperature of anything. It executes move commands and accumulates experience. The Pokédex entry describes a creature that the game never quite shows, something wilder and stranger and more deeply embedded in the world's physics than the battle system has room to express. These entries are not inaccurate. They are glimpses of a version of the creature that exists somewhere beneath the surface of the game's mechanics. The Chandelure entry notes that it absorbs the spirit of those it burns, and that absorbed spirits wander without direction for eternity. The Regigigas entry warns that it swallows people whole and turns them into mummies. The Dusk Noir entry claims it sends people to the spirit world when it opens the mouth on its belly, guided by signals from the spirit world itself. None of these things happen in gameplay, but they are recorded in the Pokédex with the same matter-of-fact tone used for nutritional habits and preferred habitats, as if they are simply natural facts about these creatures' lives that happen to fall outside the scope of what trainer and Pokémon do together in a battle. The Pokédex builds a world that is larger and stranger than the one the player navigates, and that largeness is one of the things that makes the world feel genuinely real. The ancient civilizations that left their marks on the Pokémon world's landscape are worth considering in greater detail than the main narrative usually provides. The civilization that built the structures now called the Ruins of Alph in Johto was sophisticated enough to work in unknown script, to align their structures with astronomical phenomena, and to create chambers that have remained structurally sound for long enough that they are still accessible when a trainer walks through Johto centuries later. Nothing about the Ruins of Alph is explained. There is no character who sits at the entrance and provides historical context. The ruins simply exist, and their age and their purpose and the people who built them are left to the imagination of anyone who enters. The same is true of the sealed chamber in Hoenn, of the Celestica ruins in Hisui, of the desert resort in Unova, of the ruins of life and abundance and hope and conflict scattered across Alola. Each one is a structure built by people who are no longer present for purposes that are no longer entirely clear, in a style that reflects a relationship with Pokémon and with the land that differs in ways both large and small from the relationship that the contemporary cultures in those regions maintain. The archaeology of the Pokémon world is its own kind of storytelling, a genre of narrative that speaks through walls and carvings and the orientation of doorways rather than through dialogue. The Pokémon World Tournament facility in Unova's Black 2 and White 2 brings together gym leaders and champions from multiple regions in a single competitive space, and the conversations available there are among the franchise's richest sources of character depth for figures who might otherwise remain defined by their single appearance in their home region. Talking to Cynthia in the World Tournament context adds texture to a character who is already among the franchise's most developed, giving her opinions about other regions and other champions that she would have no occasion to express within the bounds of her home game. The World Tournament is the franchise's most explicit acknowledgement that the regions coexist simultaneously, that the champions and leaders of all regions are alive and active at the same time, that the world is not a series of separate stories, but a single world in which many different stories are happening at once. The train connecting Goldenrod City in Johto to Saffron City in Kanto is one of the franchise's most understated details. It is a functional transportation link between two regions, the kind of infrastructure that implies a history of relationship and mutual development stretching back before the games begin. Someone decided to build a train between Johto and Kanto. The engineering required to do that, the economic rationale, the political agreements between whatever governing bodies existed in each region, all of that happened before the player's journey begins, and none of it is discussed. The train simply runs, carrying passengers between regions as if it has always done so, as if the connection between Johto and Kanto is simply a fact of geography rather than a consequence of accumulated human decisions. The Pokémon world's relationship with technology is one of its most carefully maintained internal consistencies. The world has Pokeballs, which are extraordinary technological achievements requiring a sophisticated understanding of materials, science, miniaturization, and the physics of containment. It has the PC storage system, which appears to digitize Pokémon and store them as data on remote servers, implying a network infrastructure and data science capability far in advance of anything else the world has demonstrably achieved. It has video phones and Pokegear and the Pokenav and the Rotom phone. And yet it also has sailing ships and horses and hand-drawn maps and villages that appear to have no electricity. The technology in the Pokemon world does not follow a single developmental timeline. Some technologies arrived through the involvement of Pokemon, whose abilities made certain things possible that ordinary physics would not permit. The Pokeball was invented by a Pokemon scientist named Sylph, or by the inventor Kurt, who makes them from apricorns, depending on which tradition you follow, using materials and techniques that derive from Pokemon-related phenomena rather than from purely human engineering. The storage system was invented by Bill, who appears to have achieved some kind of merger between his own body and the system during development, suggesting that the technology works in ways that he understands imperfectly, even as its creator. The Pokemon world's technological landscape is an uneven one, full of extraordinary capabilities in specific domains and notable absences in others. And that unevenness is part of what makes it feel like a world that developed naturally, rather than one that was designed to be internally consistent at every point. The invention of the Pokeball changed everything. Before Pokeballs, the relationship between humans and Pokemon was necessarily different, more territorial, more defined by proximity and cohabitation and gradual mutual accommodation, rather than by the portable partnership that Pokeballs enable. A trainer who can carry 6 Pokemon anywhere they go is a fundamentally different kind of human-Pokemon relationship than one who lives in a community alongside Pokemon that range freely through the surrounding landscape and cooperate with humans on terms negotiated through long familiarity rather than through the specific compact represented by capture and partnership. Hisui shows the pre-Pokeball world in practice. The Galaxy team's Survey Corps works with Pokemon in ways that require constant negotiation and considerable danger. Wild Pokemon are genuinely threatening in Hisui, not because the game has higher difficulty settings, but because the relationship between humans and Pokemon in that era has not yet been domesticated by the Pokeball system. The great clans maintain their relationships with noble Pokemon through traditions of wardenship that are essentially social contracts between communities and specific creatures, rather than through the individual ownership and training model that the Pokeball enables. Watching that world shift across the events of Legends, Arceus, towards something that begins to resemble the Pokeball era, is watching a fundamental transformation in the social organization of the Pokemon world happen in real time. Professor Magnolia in Galar dedicated her research career to understanding Dynamax, and the notes she accumulated over decades formed the foundation for everything that her granddaughter Sonia was able to discover about the Darkest Day and the true nature of the Galar legendaries. The relationship between generational research in the Pokemon world, the way each professor builds on what came before, creates a picture of scientific institutions that have been developing for a very long time, accumulating knowledge about Pokemon in ways that the individual trainer journeys both contribute to and draw from. Professor Kukui in Alola is notable for founding the Alola Pokemon League during the events of Sun and Moon, creating a new institution within the game's time frame, rather than inheriting one that has existed for generations. Watching the league be built, watching the traditions around it be established, watching the first champion title be contested for the first time, gives players a sense of how the league systems in other regions must have come into existence at some point in their own histories through similar acts of institution building that are now invisible because they happened long enough ago that the institutions they created feel simply like facts of the landscape. The berry system across multiple regions speaks to a long tradition of Pokemon world horticulture that never receives explicit acknowledgement but is always present in the background. Berries grow on trees that must be planted and tended. The varieties of berry, their effects when eaten by Pokemon, their uses in Pokeblock and Poffin and other preparation methods, All of this implies generations of selective cultivation and agricultural knowledge. The farmers who developed these varieties are not named anywhere in the games. Their contribution to the Pokémon world, the accumulated horticultural knowledge represented by the dozens of berry varieties, exists as pure background, as the kind of thing that is simply present in the world rather than foregrounded as something worth specifically acknowledging. The fishing traditions of the Pokémon world deserve particular notice. Old Rod and Good Rod and Super Rod are items passed between trainers and fishermen as gifts, objects that carry within them the knowledge encoded in their construction, the understanding of what weight and what hook and what line are appropriate for what depth and what quarry. The fishermen who appear on routes throughout the games, patient figures standing at the edges of water with their lines cast, represent an entire subculture of Pokémon relationship, one organized around patience and observation and the particular knowledge of what lives below the surface of things. They are not trainers in the conventional sense. They are something older, something that predates the League system and will probably outlast it. The Pokémon world's relationship with weather deserves attention as a topic that the games engage with more directly than players sometimes notice. The weather in Hoenn is managed in part by Kyogre and Groudon, whose ancient rivalry expressed itself in the shaping of ocean and continent. When they stir, the weather changes in ways that are not simply atmospheric, but geological. Cast Form, a Pokémon developed by the Weather Institute south of Fortree City, changes its form in response to weather conditions, and the Weather Institute itself represents a human attempt to study and potentially influence weather patterns in a region where weather is partially determined by forces that sleep in the deep ocean and beneath volcanic mountains. Tornadus and Thundurus and Landorus and Unova represent weather phenomena in Pokémon form, embodiments of the forces that bring storms and lightning and the agricultural rain that makes Unova's fertile lands productive. Their mythology in Unova depicts them as beings who must be balanced, whose individual excesses create destruction, but whose combined presence and the mediation of Landorus creates the conditions that allow life to flourish. The seasonal system in Black and White, which changes the accessibility of certain locations and the availability of certain Pokémon depending on the time of year, reflects a world in which the seasons are not simply background setting, but active forces that shape what is possible. The Snow Point Temple in Sinnoh, accessible only in the northern reaches of the region where the cold is genuine and persistent, holds within it a sealed Regigigas that can only be awakened in the presence of the other three Regis brought from Hoenn. The requirement to gather these specific legendary Pokémon from another region to bring them into proximity with the sleeping giant in the frozen temple suggests a set of relationships between these creatures that spans regions and requires a trainer who has moved between worlds rather than stayed within one. The Regis recognize each other across the distance of their sealed conditions, and their presence together creates the conditions for something that their absence maintains in dormancy. Weather-related legendary encounters across all the regions follow a similar pattern of presence and dormancy, of forces that are always there, but that the ordinary world only encounters directly when the conditions that usually contain them are disrupted. Rayquaza in the sky above the clouds, Kyogre in the ocean depth, Groudon beneath the volcanic earth. These are not creatures that have always been absent from the world. They have always been present in it. The absence is the absence of encounter, of the specific disruption that brings a force that was already there into direct contact with the surface world that usually experiences it only as weather and geology. The relationship between legendary Pokémon and the human communities that have developed in proximity to them is one of the franchise's most persistent and most varied themes. Some communities worship their regional legendary, some fear it, some have developed elaborate traditions of both worship and containment, building shrines that honor the legendary, while also ensuring that it remains in its appropriate place and does not move freely through the spaces that humans have claimed. The Draconid people's relationship with Rayquaza represents one extreme, a community that has organized its entire cultural purpose around the obligation to communicate with the legendary when the time comes. The communities of Johto who built the Tin Tower represent another, a relationship of mutual invitation and careful maintenance that broke down when one party stopped holding up their end of the implicit agreement. Lugia's retreat to the Whirl Islands after the Brass Tower fire is described differently in different accounts, sometimes as a choice and sometimes as a withdrawal, sometimes as a response to grief, and sometimes as a recognition that the conditions for the previous arrangement no longer existed. What all the accounts agree on is that Lugia did not simply disappear. It went somewhere specific, somewhere it could be found again by those who knew where to look and what to bring with them. The Whirl Islands are not simply a maze of sea caves. They are a home that Lugia chose, a place that met whatever conditions a being of that nature requires for sustained presence. Understanding Lugia's choice of the Whirl Islands as a home tells you something about Lugia that its Pokédex entry does not. Ho-Oh's trajectory after the Tin Tower fire is different. It moves. The sightings of Ho-Oh across different accounts and different regions suggest a legendary that has not settled into a fixed retreat, but has continued to travel, to observe, to participate in the world from the outside in a way that Lugia, retreated to its depths, does not. The tradition that holds that seeing Ho-Oh brings eternal happiness reflects a creature that is understood to be rare in its appearances, to surface into the visible world only under circumstances that are themselves exceptional. Ash's encounter with Ho-Oh at the very beginning of the anime, an encounter that most people he later tells about it do not believe, sets a trajectory for the entire story that the anime tells, the idea that the extraordinary has already presented itself and that the work is now to prove worthy of what was briefly glimpsed. The mythology around Celebi and time is among the franchise's most carefully constructed. Celebi is the keeper of the forest, associated specifically with the Ilex forest of Johto, but it is also a time traveler whose movements leave traces in different eras. The accounts of Celebi's sightings across the games and associated media suggest a creature that experiences time differently from any other Pokémon, for whom the boundary between past and present and future is permeable in ways that it is not for creatures embedded in ordinary time. Celebi appeared in the Ilex forest to a young man who would grow up to be the rocket executive that Gold and Silver's player confronts at the Pokémon Shrine. Celebi's encounter with Ethan and Lyra in the Pokewalker associated events connects them to a version of events that happened before the games begin. The idea that Celebs has been moving through the Ilex forest across different time periods, occasionally becoming visible to the people who are there, occasionally interacting with events in ways that change what happens next, suggests a version of the Ilex forest that is not simply a location, but a temporally complex space, a place where different moments of its history exist simultaneously in some sense, accessible to a creature that can move between them. The shrine at the forest's heart is built for a Pokémon that is not reliably present in any single moment, that must be honored across time rather than in a specific encounter. The tradition of tending the shrine is the tradition of maintaining a relationship with something that may not be there when you look but will recognize, across whatever distance of time separates you, that the tending was done. Jirachi, sealed in the Millennium Comet, and awakening only when the comet appears every 1,000 years, represents a different relationship with time, one of extreme dormancy rather than of constant movement. Jirachi's 1,000-year sleep means that each awakening finds it in a world that has changed more dramatically than a sleeping creature can prepare for. The people and cultures and relationships that existed during one awakening will be entirely different during the next. Jirachi does not accumulate the experience of watching the world change. It arrives repeatedly into a world that has been changing without it and must orient itself fresh each time. There is something quietly melancholy about a creature designed to grant wishes that can only receive those wishes once every 1,000 years, that must compress all its interaction with the world into the brief window of the comet's passage before returning to its long, lightless wait. The battle frontier facilities that appear in certain games, the battle tower and battle palace and battle factory and battle pyramid and battle arena and battle pike and battle dome, represent the franchise's engagement with competitive battling at its most formalized and most varied. Each facility tests a different aspect of the trainer-Pokemon relationship. The Battle Palace allows Pokemon to choose their own moves based on their nature, removing the trainer's direct control and testing whether the bond between trainer and Pokemon is deep enough that the Pokemon's independent choices will be effective. The Battle Factory asks trainers to work with rental Pokemon they have never trained themselves, testing whether competitive knowledge is transferable to unfamiliar partners. The Battle Pyramid strips trainers of their items and their map, requiring navigation through floors of wild Pokemon encounters with no external support. The Battle Frontier's most iconic figure is Palmer, the tower tycoon who reveals himself to be Barry's father, a detail that reframes the entire concept of the Frontier Brain as someone whose extreme dedication to battling has shaped his family life in ways the games do not fully examine. The Frontier Brains, across all the facilities that include them, share a quality of specialists who have found their particular corner of competitive battling and developed within it to a level that most trainers never reach. Not because most trainers lack talent, but because most trainers have not chosen to specialize with the same narrowness of focus. Annabelle, the Salon Maiden of the Battle Pike in Emerald, appears in Sun and Moon as an agent of the International Police, working with Looker to address Ultra Beast incursions. The reappearance of a Battle Frontier figure as an active character in a game set generations later raises questions about time and aging that the games do not address, but it also suggests that the characters who inhabit the world of these games have ongoing lives that extend beyond their moments of visibility to the player, that they continue to make choices and develop and change even when no player's attention is on them. The Contest Spectacular system in Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire deepens the contest mechanics from the original Ruby and Sapphire with new visual presentation and additional complexity in the performance mechanics. Lucia, the contest idol, who serves as the face of contests in those games, represents a figure whose relationship with her Altaria is centered entirely on beauty and performance and the joy of shared expression rather than on competitive battling. Her fame in Hoenn, the way she is recognized and celebrated by the public, suggests a culture that values Pokemon performance as highly as it values Pokemon battling, that has developed infrastructure for celebrating both and does not privilege one over the other. The Pokemon musical in Unova, the contest hall equivalent for that region, takes a different approach to the same underlying question about how to celebrate the non-combat aspects of the trainer-Pokemon relationship. The musical's emphasis on costume and collective performance, on the audience's response to a show, rather than on judges' evaluation of specific qualities, reflects something about Unova's culture, its urban density, and its theatrical traditions, and its comfort with spectacle that distinguishes it from Hoenn's more personal and evaluative contest approach. Both systems ask trainers to pay attention to their Pokemon's personality and presentation in ways that the battle system does not require. Both create space for a version of the trainer-Pokemon relationship that is about expression rather than competition. The Pokemon showcases in Kalos take this further toward performance and away from evaluation, with the audience voting on which performer they prefer, rather than a panel of judges applying specific criteria. Showcases are public and participatory in a way that contests are not quite, inviting the audience into the evaluation process rather than leaving judgment to specialists. Serena's showcase journey in the anime represents one of that series' most detailed explorations of what it means to develop a performance identity alongside a Pokemon, to find not just what you are good at, but what you genuinely want to express, and to practice expressing it well enough that others want to watch. The champion figures across all the regions share certain qualities, despite the enormous differences between the regions they represent and the paths they took to their positions. Each one is a person who has developed a genuine relationship with the battling form they prefer, who has made choices about what kind of trainer they want to be that go beyond simple accumulation of power. Cynthia's scholarly approach, Stephen's geological passion, Iris's direct emotionality, Diantha's theatrical grace, Kukui's foundational joy in battling for its own sake. Each champion's character is inseparable from their battling style in ways that the games make legible through the composition of their teams and the way they speak about Pokémon. Lance's dual role as both Kanto's champion and Johto's champion reflects a situation where a single individual has managed to hold two regional titles, something that speaks to his extraordinary ability, but also to the peculiarities of how the Elite Four system functions when a trainer of sufficient skill simply keeps winning. The transition of the championship title to Red in Kanto, and then Red's apparent withdrawal from public competitive battling to train alone on Mount Silver, leaves the question of who holds the Kanto championship in a somewhat ambiguous state that later games handle differently depending on their framing. Wallace's movement between the role of gym leader and champion in Hoenn, with Stephen temporarily stepping away and Wallace stepping up, represents another kind of championship flux, the recognition that the position is not permanently fixed to a single individual, but changes when the circumstances that defined the previous arrangement change. The Pokemon League is not simply a hierarchy with a permanent apex. It is a dynamic system in which the most skilled trainer at any given moment holds the highest position, and that most skilled trainer changes over time. The legendary Pokemon associated with creation and destruction across different regions each embody a different understanding of what those concepts mean in the context of the Pokemon world. Yveltal's absorption of life energy and its eventual dormancy as a cocoon is destruction in service of eventual renewal rather than simply extinction. Xerneas's restoration of life from dormancy and its own eventual dormancy when its power is spent is creation that has limits, that cannot be maintained indefinitely, that requires its own period of withdrawal. The two legendaries of Kalos are not simply opposed. They are partners in a cycle that neither completes without the other, creation and dissolution as equally necessary aspects of a single, ongoing process. Solgaleo and Lunala in Alola embody the sun and moon, not as astronomical bodies, but as the beings that carry those celestial forces through the world's daily and monthly rhythms. Their evolution from Cosmog, the small nebula Pokemon that players carry through sun and moon, suggests that the embodiments of celestial forces are not fixed entities, but developmental ones, that Cosmog is already Solgaleo or Lunala in potential, waiting for the conditions that will allow its full expression. The idea that the player is carrying, in their party, the dormant potential of a sunbearer or moonbearer without knowing it for most of the game creates a kind of dramatic irony that the eventual revelation makes retrospectively meaningful. Necrozma, the light-devouring creature of ultraspace that has lost its own light and seeks to reclaim it, represents a different kind of cosmic force, one that has been damaged and is acting from a place of deprivation rather than abundance. Its history, its original form as the emitter of light that gave the ultra-megalopolis its name, before something happened to take that light away, makes it a creature of genuine tragedy rather than simply a villain. The restoration of Necrozma's original form and its return to providing light for ultraspace is one of Sun and Moon's quieter emotional resolutions, a moment where what looked like an antagonist reveals itself as a victim trying to recover what was taken. The ultra-megalopolis in Ultra-Sun and Ultra-Moon, the city in ultraspace that has been in darkness since Necrozma's light was taken, is one of the franchise's most striking locations precisely because of what it represents about the relationship between a community and the legendary Pokémon it depends on. The people of Ultra-Megalopolis are not villains and not heroes. They are survivors of something that happened to their world, people who have maintained their civilization through the long darkness, who have preserved their city and their culture and their technology across an extended period of deprivation. Though Ether Foundation's involvement in ultraspace and the complicated relationship between human curiosity and Ultra Beast welfare that the games explore sits alongside the Ultra-Megalopolis storyline as part of the same broader question about what the right relationship between humans and the extraordinary forces of the Pokémon world looks like. The Cosmog populations in ultraspace suggest that the Pokémon that becomes Solgaleo or Lunala in Alola is not unique, that the celestial bearer form is one that arises repeatedly across the multiverse in response to whatever conditions produce it. The existence of multiple ultra wormholes connecting the ordinary Pokémon world to ultraspace and beyond implies a larger architecture of connected realities that the games have only begun to explore. Each Ultra Beast comes from a specific ecology, from a world shaped by conditions that the ordinary Pokémon world has not experienced, and the diversity of Ultra Beasts suggests the diversity of those worlds, each one a different answer to the question of what kind of creatures a world will produce. The Paldean Pokémon's relationship with their Mediterranean-influenced environment is visible not just in their designs, but in their ecological roles. Armarouge and Ceruledge, the version-exclusive Pokémon, carry within them the military aesthetic of knights and soldiers, but expressed in Pokémon form, which is to say as creatures that are also genuinely living things, with biological needs and social behaviors that exist alongside their impressive combat capabilities. The way Paldea's open world distributes these Pokémon across the landscape, making different encounters possible in different biomes, creates a sense of ecological authenticity that earlier games achieved differently through encounter tables. The Terra phenomenon, the crystalline transformation that Paldean Pokémon can undergo, is tied to the specific geological character of the Paldean landscape, to the terrestrial energy that flows through the earth of the region in patterns connected to the Area Zero crater and to Terra Pegasus' long presence within it. The appearance of Terra Pokémon in the overworld, glittering and crystalline in the sunlight of Paldea's roots, is the most immediate and visible expression of Terra Pegasus' ancient influence on the region, the way a creature that has been there for 2 million years leaves its mark on the landscape not just through geography, but through the very nature of the Pokémon that have developed in proximity to it. The Pokémon Scarlet and Violet DLC content, the teal mask set in Kitakami, and the indigo discs set in the underwater terrarium of Blueberry Academy, each adds ecological and mythological depth in different registers. Kitakami's festival traditions, its loyal 3 mythology, and the truth that the player discovers about Ogerpon's history add to the kind of quiet revisionism to received history that the Pokémon world does particularly well, The revelation that what a community has been celebrating is not what actually happened, that the villain of the traditional story was actually a victim. The terrarium's enclosed biomes, each one a miniaturized version of a different regional ecology, represent a human attempt to collect and preserve different environments, which has something melancholy in it, alongside its evident wonder, the recognition that someone believed these biomes needed to be preserved, which implies they might otherwise be lost. The paradox Pokémon that inhabit Area Zero are worth considering as a group rather than as individual creatures, because the pattern they collectively represent is as significant as any individual design. Every paradox Pokémon is a version of a creature that currently exists in the present day, altered by time in either direction. The ancient forms are more organic, more naturalistic, less shaped by the aesthetic categories that contemporary Pokémon fulfill. The future forms are more mechanical, more geometric, suggesting a trajectory towards something that is still recognizably descended from the original creature, but has been shaped by entirely different pressures than the ones that shaped its contemporary form. What the paradox Pokémon collectively suggest is that the creatures the player trains and battles and carries through their journey are not fixed, eternal forms, but temporary expressions of a developmental line that extends backward into a wilder past and forward into a more mechanical future. Today's Donphan is not the end of the line. It is a point on a trajectory shaped by the conditions of today, which will continue to be shaped by whatever conditions come next. This is in a sense what evolution always implies, but the paradox Pokémon make it visible in a way that the ordinary game mechanics do not. The player can stand in Area Zero and look at ancient Donphan and future Donphan and understand, more directly than the games usually permit, that the contemporary Donphan exists at a particular moment, rather than as a permanent form. Iron Valiant, the future form of what appears to be a merger of Gardevoir and Galad, is perhaps the most striking of the future paradox Pokémon because it represents not just the future of a single species, but the convergence of two species into one. If the future indeed merges what are currently two separate lineages, this suggests a future ecology in which the distinctions that the present maintains between different Pokémon are not permanent, that what is separate now may be unified by whatever pressures the far future imposes. The speculative biology implied by Iron Valiant is as interesting as anything in the game's explicit lore. The question of what happens to Pokémon that are released, that are abandoned, that outlive their trainers, is one that the games touch on rarely but always with care, when they do. The ghost-type Pokémon clustered in the old chateau in Sinnoh are connected, in the optional detail of their encounters, to the history of the family that once lived in that building. The girl's Gengar is implied to be a Clefairy that wished to be close to the girl it belonged to, and was transformed by that wish into a Pokémon that could stay. This is speculation built from sparse evidence, from the juxtaposition of a ghost-type Gengar and a framed picture of a Clefairy, but it is the kind of speculation that the Pokémon world's design consistently encourages, the feeling that there is always more story behind what is visible than the game has room to explicitly tell. The Pokémon Village in Kalos is the franchise's most direct engagement with the question of abandoned Pokémon, and the detail that these Pokémon have formed a community in the wild after their abandonment suggests that they have done something extraordinary, that they have not simply reverted to unsocialized wild Pokémon, but have maintained, in a wild context, some of the social behaviors that their lives with trainers helped to develop. They are neither the Pokémon they were when they lived with trainers, nor simply wild Pokémon. They are something that exists in between, a category the game creates and then does not fully explore, leaving the player to draw their own conclusions about what it means. The Safari Zone mechanics, which require the player to use bait and rocks, rather than battle commands to influence a wild Pokemon's likelihood of being caught, reflect a different model of the human Pokemon encounter than the standard battle and capture system provides. In the Safari Zone, the player cannot rely on their own Pokemon's strength or the accumulated trust of their team. They must work with a limited toolkit, must understand something about the behavior of the Pokemon they are approaching, must be patient in a way that the standard battle system does not require. The Safari Zone is a space where the ordinary power relationships of the trainer system are deliberately suspended, where what the player knows about Pokemon behavior matters more than what their team is capable of. The Pokemon world's many islands carry particular ecological significance because island species develop differently from mainland ones, shaped by isolation and by the specific resources available in a bounded space. The Sevii Islands in Kanto, the Whirl Islands in Johto, the Battle Island in Hoenn, the Lily of the Valley Island where Sinnoh's Pokemon League is located, the Unova side of the water routes, the many islands of Alola, each one represents an ecology that developed at least partially in isolation from the surrounding mainland, producing creatures and relationships between creatures that mainlands do not host. The Alolan regional variants are the franchise's most systematic exploration of what island isolation does to species, but the principle is present throughout the world in less explicit ways. The Pokemon encountered on the Sevii Islands include species from Johto and Hoenn that do not appear in the main Kanto region, suggesting that the islands serve as a kind of ecological bridge, a place where the distributions of different mainland species overlap in ways they do not on the mainlands themselves. The political and cultural history of the Sevii Islands, which is gestured at in the ruins and the inhabitants but never fully explained, adds to the sense of a place that has its own story separate from Kanto's, that has been doing something for a long time that Kanto's mainland is only partially aware of. The relationship between islands and legendary Pokemon is consistent across the regions. Many of the franchise's most significant legendary encounters are on islands or in locations that have something island-like about them in their isolation and their accessibility. The Seafoam Islands host Articuno. The Naval Rock that appears in certain event distributions hosts Ho-Oh and Lugia. The island of New Moon, where Darkrai can be found in Sinnoh. The Flower Paradise where Shaman lives. The island of Gracidea, where the shaman that arrive there transform into their sky form. Islands in the Pokemon world are consistently places where the boundary between the ordinary world and the extraordinary world is thinner, where what lives there has been shaped by conditions of isolation into something that the mainland cannot produce. The question of how legendary Pokemon first came to be associated with specific locations is one that the world gestures toward without fully answering. Articuno in the Seafoam Islands has presumably been there for a very long time, long enough that the islands are understood as its territory by the people who live in the region. But there must have been a first moment when Articuno arrived at the Seafoam Islands, or was born there, or found in those caves the conditions it needed. The absence of any account of that first moment is part of the legendary's quality of apparent permanence. The sense that they were always there, that their presence in these locations predates any human memory of the region. The way legendary Pokemon are encountered, the specific conditions that must be met before the player can access the encounter, often encodes something about the legendary's nature or about the relationship between the legendary and the human community of the region. Regirock requires Braille reading and specific Pokemon conditions in the party. Azelf and Uxie and Maesprit require reaching the lakes where they reside. Dialga and Palkia require ascending to the spear pillar. In each case, the encounter condition is a form of preparation, a requirement that the trainer demonstrates specific knowledge or capability before the meeting takes place. The legendary does not come to the trainer. The trainer must come to the legendary on the legendary's terms. Roaming legendaries, the Pokemon that are released into the wild and move from route to route in ways that make them genuinely difficult to encounter deliberately, represent a different philosophy about how legendary encounters should work. Entei and Raikou and Suicune in Johto, Latias and Latios in Hoenn, the various roaming legendaries in other games, create encounters that require persistence and luck in approximately equal measure, that feel genuinely wild in a way that a stationary encounter in a fixed location does not quite achieve. The roaming legendary is not waiting for you. It is living its life, and you must intersect with that life rather than arriving at the place where it rests and presenting yourself. The relationship between the player's own journey and the longer history of the Pokemon world is always present as a kind of background pressure, the sense that what is happening in the player's specific story is happening within a context that extends far beyond it. When the player defeats the Pokemon League for the first time, they are entering a tradition that has existed for generations, taking a position in a hierarchy that has been held by others before and will be held by others after. The championship is not an ending. It is a position within an ongoing institution, and the player who holds it, for however long they hold it, is only the most recent in a line that stretches back to when the league was first established. The post-game content in many Pokemon games reflects this by expanding the world outward after the story's formal conclusion, revealing that the region contains more than the journey required the player to see. The battle frontier accessible after the Hoenn Elite Four, the post-game storyline of Black 2 and White 2, the expanded island exploration available in Alola after the player becomes champion, all of these extend the world in ways that the main story does not require, offering players who want more the material for a longer engagement with the same world. The National Pokédex, available after completing the Regional Pokédex in certain games, represents the most ambitious version of this post-game expansion, opening the entire world of Pokémon to encounter and collection rather than restricting the player to the species native to their current region. Completing the National Pokédex is a project that extends far beyond any individual journey, requiring trades and events and the collaboration of multiple players, and the games that offer it as a goal acknowledge this by making the reward for completion modest by the standards of what the completion required. Professor Oak's evaluation, a diploma from the professor, a small acknowledgement that a very large thing has been accomplished. The project was its own reward. The enduring quality of the Pokemon franchise, the reason it has sustained across decades in ways that few entertainment properties manage, is not simply its recognizable characters or its competitive depth or its collecting mechanics. It is the consistency with which it offers a world that rewards continued attention, that reveals new depth with every returning visit, that contains within it enough genuine mystery and enough genuine beauty that players of very different temperaments find within it something worth returning to. A child playing Pokemon for the first time experiences a world of wonder and discovery, of creatures that seem both magical and strangely natural, of friendships that develop through shared adventures. An adult returning to the same games or encountering the newer ones with the accumulated knowledge of the franchise's history experiences a different kind of engagement, one that includes the layers of mythology and world building and thematic depth that the child could sense but not yet articulate. The world does not become less when you understand it better. It becomes more because what was opaque becomes readable without losing any of its wonder. The timeline of the Pokemon world is a structure built over decades by many different people, added to with each new game and each new region, not always perfectly consistent, but always pointing in the same direction, toward a world that has been here for a very long time and will be here for a very long time after the current stories conclude. The primordial egg, the void, the first act of creation, these are not simply background mythology for the competitive battling and the collection mechanics. They are the foundation of a world that has been thought about deeply and loved carefully, a world that continues to expand into whatever territory the next generation of creators will find available to them. The Pokémon world's treatment of illness and healing is one of its most thoughtfully understated elements. Pokémon centers exist in every significant settlement across every region, offering free healing to any trainer who enters. The consistency of this institution, present in every town regardless of that town's size or wealth or geographic position, implies a social contract about the provision of Pokémon healthcare that the games never explicitly discuss but always demonstrate. The Pokémon Center is not a luxury. It is infrastructure as basic to the world as roots and bridges, and its presence everywhere suggests a society that has decided at some foundational level that Pokémon health is a collective responsibility rather than an individual one. Nurse Joy's presence in every Pokémon Center, her consistent appearance and consistent name across all regions and all games, is one of those details that becomes more interesting the more carefully you consider it. The in-universe explanation offered in the anime that the Joys are a large family with a strong hereditary resemblance is not the only possible reading. The Joys could also be read as an institution made human, the personification of the healing system itself, present everywhere because the healing system is everywhere. Either reading, the biological one or the symbolic one, makes the ubiquity of Nurse Joy into something more thoughtful than simple convenience. Officer Jenny occupies a similar role in the world's law enforcement. Consistent across regions, consistently named, consistently representing the institutional presence of order and safety in a world where trainers move freely and powerful creatures coexist with ordinary life. The combination of Nurse Joy and Officer Jenny creates a world in which the most essential social services, healing, and safety are always present and always recognizable, regardless of where a trainer's journey takes them. The world wants you to be safe and cared for. It has arranged itself to ensure that those things are available everywhere you might go. The bike shops in various regions offer another quietly interesting economic detail. Bicycles are expensive enough that a trainer on a journey budget cannot easily afford one, but available enough that a shop can be maintained in a town that might otherwise seem too small to support specialty retail. The relationship between the bike shop in Cerulean City and the Pokémon fan club in Vermilion City, where the chairman's attachment to his Pokémon produces a ticket that can be exchanged for a bicycle, is a small story about the informal economy of affection and services that exists alongside the formal economy of the Pokémart and the exchange. The Pokémart system, present in towns throughout every region, maintains a consistent baseline inventory of healing items and Pokéballs that expands in direct proportion to the number of gym badges a trainer has earned. This detail, that the shops know how many badges you have and stock their shelves accordingly, implies a commerce system that is integrated with the League Challenge in ways that the game never explicitly explains. The shops are not simply responding to what they imagine a trainer at your level of advancement will need. They are responding to information about your specific progress. The world is paying attention to you in ways it does not announce. The department stores in Celadon, Goldenrod, Lily Cove, Veilstone, Castalia, Lumoise, and other major cities offer a different commercial experience. The sense of a world that has developed sufficient economic complexity to support specialty retail at scale, floors dedicated to specific categories of goods, a variety of items that no single small-town Pokémart could stock. The department store is a sign of urban development, of the accumulation of population and commerce that certain locations have achieved while others remain at the single Pokemart level of economic activity. Browsing a department store's floors is a form of world building, a way of understanding what a city has decided it wants to offer. The Goldenrod Game Corner and its equivalents in other regions, the slot machines and the coin exchange, and the rare Pokemon and items available for coins accumulated through chance represent a form of entertainment economy that the games have handled differently across different generations and different regional distribution markets. The Game Corner is a space where the rules of the rest of the Pokemon world are temporarily suspended, where chance matters more than skill, and where the most desirable rewards are distributed randomly rather than through merit. Its presence in a world built around the very different philosophy of cultivation and training is a kind of counterpoint and an acknowledgement that not all of life's rewards come from the careful development of skill. The relationship between money and Pokemon training is handled in the games with a matter-of-factness that obscures how interesting it actually is. Trainers earn money by winning battles against other trainers. The amount earned is determined by the level of the winning Pokemon and the prize money set by the defeated trainer. This creates an economy in which the accumulation of battle experience and the accumulation of financial resources are directly linked, in which becoming a better trainer and becoming more financially secure are the same project. The trainer who is too poor to buy healing items is the same trainer who has not yet won enough battles, and winning more battles produces both better Pokemon and more money to support those Pokemon's development. The Elite Four battle in most games halves the player's money if they lose, a mechanical punishment that encodes a philosophy about risk and reward in high-stakes competition. Losing matters. It costs something concrete. This mechanic, often complained about by players who find themselves financially depleted after a series of losses, actually reflects something true about what high-stakes competition feels like when you are not yet ready for it. The loss is not just a setback in terms of progress. It is a resource depletion that requires rebuilding before another attempt is viable. The hidden items scattered throughout every route and every building and every cave in the Pokemon world are another form of attention reward, a system that consistently distributes small discoveries to players who take the time to explore thoroughly, rather than moving directly from objective to objective, a potion hidden in the grass beside the path, a PP up buried in the sand of a desert, a rare berry growing in an unexpected location. These items are not significant individually, but they create collectively the sense of a world that has distributed its treasures widely and quietly, that rewards the player who is curious and thorough rather than simply efficient. The evolution of the Pokémon franchise's visual language across its history is as significant as its narrative development. The original Game Boy sprites, 16 by 16 pixels rendered in 4 shades of green, were the first time most players encountered these creatures. The limitations of those sprites were not simply constraints to be worked around. They were a medium with its own expressive possibilities, a pixel art language in which simplicity was a virtue because it demanded clarity. A creature had to be identifiable in 16 by 16 pixels, or it failed to communicate what it was. Gengar's wide grin, Pikachu's distinctive ear tips, Snorlax's round bulk. These designs worked in pixel art, not because they were designed for pixel art, but because they were designed to be immediately readable, and immediate readability translates across media. The transition to the Game Boy Color in gold and silver allowed the sprites to carry color, and color changed everything. Suddenly, a Pokemon's palette was part of its identity in a way it had not been when everything was rendered in varying shades. The green-gray of the original Game Boy had flattened the visual distinctions between creatures that color immediately restored. A shiny Pokémon with an alternate color scheme became distinguishable from its ordinary form in ways that the original games could not have supported. The color system opened up design possibilities that the games have been exploring ever since, including the regional variants that carry their alternate color schemes as records of their different development. The move to three-dimensional models in Pokémon X and Y in 2013 was the franchise's most dramatic visual shift, the change that required the most fundamental rethinking of how Pokémon should look and move. Designing a sprite requires understanding how a creature will read in a small, flat representation. Designing a three-dimensional model requires understanding how a creature will read from every angle, how it will move when it walks and attacks and is struck, how its surface materials will catch light. The transition was not simply a technical upgrade, but a creative challenge of a different order, and the early three-dimensional games show the seams of that challenge in ways that later entries have mostly smoothed away. The home region effect, the sense that the first Pokémon game a player experiences is in some way the definitive one, the one against which all later games are measured, is a phenomenon that the franchise has had to navigate carefully as its player base has aged and new players have continued to enter at different points in the franchise's history. A player who began with Ruby and Sapphire has a different sense of what a Pokémon game should feel like than a player who began with Black and White or with Sword and Shield. The franchise must serve all of these players simultaneously, must feel continuous enough that longtime players find something familiar and fresh enough that new players are not simply receiving a lesser version of what earlier players experienced. The National Pokédex represents one attempt to bridge this gap by ensuring that the creatures from earlier generations remain available and relevant in later ones. But the Pokémon that a player bonds with in their first game carry a specific weight that no amount of later availability can fully replicate. The starter that carried you through your first Elite Four challenge, the legendary you caught with your last Ultra Ball in a battle that lasted half an hour, the team that made you feel, for the first time, genuinely capable. These are the Pokémon that the franchise is really about, the ones that justify all the mythology and all the world building and all the careful design work that makes the world worth inhabiting. The world of Pokémon has been built to hold exactly these experiences, to be large enough and deep enough and varied enough that every player finds within it the specific combination of discovery and challenge and beauty that produces those first formative bonds. The timeline extends backward into the void and forward into the future, but it exists to support moments that are small and personal and impossible to fully convey to someone who has not had them. The vast cosmic history of Arceus and the Creation Trio and the ancient battles of Kyogre and Gruden is the context within which a child chose a Bulbasaur and began to understand what it meant to care for something and be cared for in return. The Pokémon world's handling of ancient in modern languages is one of its most evocative details. The unknown alphabet, a set of 28 symbols corresponding to the letters of the Latin alphabet plus 2 punctuation marks, appears in ruins across multiple regions, from the ruins of Alph in Johto to the Selacion ruins in Sinnoh to the desert resort in Unova. Whether the unknown came first, encoding their mysterious presence into the ruins that bear their name, or whether the ruins predate the unknown and the unknown are drawn to inscriptions that carry their own image, is a question that games deliberately leave unanswered. The unknown are both the language and the creature that the language describes, a circular relationship between symbol and meaning that the franchise has never fully resolved. The Braille inscriptions in Hoenn's Regi temples use a real-world writing system in a fantasy context, which creates a particular kind of readability for players who know Braille and a particular kind of opacity for those who do not. The choice to use Braille rather than an invented script is unusual in a franchise that generally prefers invented alphabets for its mysterious inscriptions. It suggests that whoever built the Regi temples either existed in relation to the real world in some way, or that the choice was made for players rather than for lore, giving players who know Braille a special experience of direct readability that players who do not know it cannot have. Either reading is interesting. The Celestic ruins in Sinnoh carry inscriptions about the creation trio that can be partially read, partially interpreted by Cynthia's grandmother, partially left as images rather than text. The mural at the back of the Celestic ruins depicts Dialga and Palkia and the space between them in a visual language that precedes any written tradition, that communicates through image rather than symbol. This mural is among the oldest legible artifacts in Sinnoh, a direct visual record of a cosmological understanding that the contemporary people of Sinnoh have preserved in fragments without always understanding what they are preserving. The Entrelink in Unova, a forest at the center of the Unova map, accessible through a specific game function, carries a mythology about a power that exists between the worlds of different players, a shared space that multiple trainers can access simultaneously. The concept of the Entrelink as a place that exists between individual game instances that is defined by its accessibility from multiple separate worlds suggests a Pokémon world that is not one world but many, each individual player's game a distinct version of the same landscape, with the Entrelink as the space where these versions briefly overlap. The metaphysics of this, multiple coexisting versions of the same world, each complete in itself, each accessible to the others, at specific points, anticipates the multiverse concepts that Pokémon would later develop more explicitly through the Ultra Wormhole system in Alola. The Dream World in Black and White extended this concept of accessible other spaces in a different direction, connecting the game to an online environment where players could encounter sleeping Pokémon and interact with a shared virtual garden space. The integration of the game world with an external network space was a significant conceptual shift, suggesting that the Pokémon world does not end at the boundaries of the cartridge, but extends outward into whatever infrastructure the player brings to their experience of it. The Dream World's eventual closure, when the servers that supported it were shut down, created a form of in-world loss that the games have not had to contend with elsewhere, the absence of an entire dimension of the world that once existed and no longer does. The secret bases in Hoenn and their evolution into super secret bases in Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire represent a genuinely unusual form of player expression within the Pokémon world. A trainer who carves out a space in a tree or a bush or a cave wall and decorates it according to their own preferences is engaging in a form of world building, adding something to the landscape that was not there before, and that reflects something about who they are. The secret base is the player's home within the game world, a space that they have made their own rather than simply inhabited. The ability to visit other players' secret bases, to battle the trainer mannequins that represent other players' teams, to adopt the flags that decorate their bases, creates a community layer on top of the individual experience, a way in which the landscape of Hoenn is marked by the presence of other players without those players being physically present in your game. The tree with someone else's secret base inside it is a trace of another journey, another player who passed through the same landscape and decided to leave their mark. Finding those marks is a form of connection across the distance that separate individual game instances. The fairy type, introduced in Pokémon X and Y, is the franchise's most significant retroactive addition to the type system, reassigning existing Pokémon to a new category and restructuring the type matchups that had been stable since Generation 2. The introduction of fairy type was partly a response to the competitive dominance of dragon type, which had become powerful enough that it was limiting competitive diversity. Adding a type that is super effective against dragon and immune to dragon type moves broke the dragon type's stranglehold without reducing its visual and thematic appeal. The fairy type itself, associated with charm and magic and the uncanny beauty of traditional fairy lore, gave a new thematic category to Pokémon that had previously been assigned to normal or psychic or water without quite fitting those categories perfectly. Gardevoir as a fairy type, Togekiss as a fairy type, Sylveon as the fairy type evolution of Eevees. Each of these reassignments clarified something about those Pokemon's nature that the original typing had not quite captured. The Steel type, introduced in Generation 2, performed a similar clarifying function for a different set of Pokemon and its extraordinary defensive capabilities, resisting 10 different types and being immune to poison, shaped the competitive landscape of every generation since its introduction. The balance problems created by type additions and the solutions developed to address them are part of the ongoing design history of the competitive game, a slow evolution of the rule set that parallels the slow evolution of the world's mythology and geography. The Pokemon Amy system in X and Y, and its successors Pokemon Refresh in Sun and Moon and Pokemon Camp in Sword and Shield, represent the franchise's attempts to model the effective dimension of the trainer-Pokemon relationship in interactive rather than statistical terms. These systems allow the player to pet their Pokemon, feed them, play with them, watch them interact with each other. They model a version of the relationship that the battle system cannot express, the domestic and affectionate dimension of living alongside another creature. The Pokemon that develop high affection through these systems gain benefits in battle, not through stat increases, but through behavioral expressions of their bond with the trainer. A Pokemon that has high affection might survive a hit that should have knocked it out, might land a critical hit at a key moment, might shake off a status condition through apparent willpower. These benefits are small and probabilistic rather than guaranteed, which makes them feel less like mechanical advantages and more like the genuinely unpredictable ways that deep familiarity and trust change what is possible between two individuals. Pokemon Camp and Sword and Shield added the ability to cook curry together, to share meals in the wild, to watch your entire team of 6 interact with each other without the player's direct involvement. Watching a Machamp carefully offer a piece of curry to a Jigglypuff, watching a Dragonite rest its enormous chin on a Clefairy's head, watching the social dynamics of a team emerge in small behavioral details, this is the franchise doing something that no other major franchise quite does, making visible the texture of daily life between a trainer and their Pokemon in a way that is neither combat nor competition, but simply being together. The camping system also allows players to watch their Pokemon interact with the Pokemon in other players' camps during multiplayer, creating a space for social observation that the battle system does not provide. 2 players whose teams are meeting for the first time can watch their respective Pokemon negotiate the beginnings of familiarity, cautious approach, and retreat and eventual proximity. And this observation creates a form of connection between the players that the competitive battling system organizes differently. The camp is a space for a slower kind of engagement, one that rewards patience and attention in the way that the best parts of the Pokemon world always have. The Pokemon world's approach to death and loss is carefully calibrated to acknowledge both without dwelling on either, in ways that might be inappropriate for the franchise's youngest audience. Pokemon faint rather than die in battle. Pokemon centers restore health to full in moments that the games present as genuine healing rather than miraculous resurrection. The rare instances in the games where death is directly addressed, the ghost that blocks the top of the Pokemon Tower in Lavender Town, the Marowak murdered by Team Rocket and lingering in the tower, The suggestion in certain Pokédex entries that ghost-type Pokémon are the spirits of deceased creatures are handled with a care that acknowledges the reality, while maintaining the fictional frame in which the stakes are high but not irreversible. The Marowak that haunts the Pokémon Tower is among the franchise's most genuinely moving moments, a creature whose grief and rage are visible in its behavior, whose willingness to attack even the player character reflects a mother's protective fury that did not end with her life. She remains there to protect her child, the Cubone that Team Rocket captured, and her presence in the tower is not simply a boss encounter, but a story about loss and love expressed through the mechanics of a creature that will not stand down until the wrong done to her child has been addressed. Talking to Mr. Fuji after calming the tower, learning that he was caring for that same Cubone, adds a layer to the story that makes it complete, makes the resolution into something that acknowledges both the loss and the continuation. The Pokemon graveyard mechanic in Pokemon Go, where a Pokemon that is caught and then transferred is gone but leaves a trace in the storage, represents a different medium's different approach to the question of where Pokemon go when they are no longer part of the trainer's active life. The transfer system in the main series games, which allows Pokemon to be sent to the professor in exchange for items, is presented as a benign process that the professor uses for research and study. But the fact that the transferred Pokemon is simply gone from the player's party, accessible only through the mechanics of retrieval that are not included in the standard game, leaves an ambiguity about what transfer actually means that individual players fill in according to their own comfort level with the implications. The world is patient with these ambiguities. It does not force resolution. It allows the player to hold the question of what happens to transferred Pokemon in whatever way allows them to continue playing with the lightness of spirit that the game's tone requires, while leaving room for those who want to engage with the heavier implications to do so. This balance between the world's genuine depth and the accessibility that keeps it welcoming is one of the things the franchise has managed most consistently across its decades of existence. As the light fades over the tall grass and the day's battles settle into memory, there is a particular quality to the silence of the Pokemon world at rest. The roots empty of other trainers. The wild Pokemon grow still in their preferred corners of the landscape. The lights of the nearest town glow warmly against the darkening sky, and somewhere in the PC storage, Pokemon that have not been called upon for a while rest in whatever form their digital existence takes, patient as everything in this world is patient, waiting for the morning and the next route and the next encounter that will ask them to be exactly what they have always been. That continuity is the deepest thing about the Pokemon world, deeper than its mythology and its competitive systems and its carefully developed regional ecologies. The world persists. It was here before the player arrived, and it will be here after the player sets down the game. The trainers, and the towns, and the tall grass, and the ancient ruins, and the sleeping legendaries, and the patient Pokemon in their Pokeballs, all of them continue in whatever way they continue, ready for the next moment of attention, ready to be exactly themselves whenever the next journey begins. The Pokemon world's geographic diversity across its regions reflects a genuine attempt to render different kinds of landscape, different climates, different ecological relationships between the land and the creatures that inhabit it. Kanto is temperate, its roots varying between the rocky terrain near Pewter City and the grassy plains near Pallet Town and the coastal areas near Cinnabar Island, a region that feels like a recognizable piece of somewhere, familiar enough to function as an introduction to what a Pokemon world is. Johto's landscape feels older, more settled, more layered with tradition, its national park and its forested roots and its ancient towers suggesting a relationship between the human and natural worlds that has been developing for longer than Kanto's. Hoenn's tropical lushness, its vast ocean roots and volcanic mountains, and the sense that the land itself is still being shaped by geological processes underway in real time, gives it a character that feels genuinely different from Kanto and Johto, despite being part of the same world. The designers understood that different regions must feel like different places, must have different textures and different default lighting and different ambient sounds if they are to register as genuinely distinct rather than simply as different configurations of the same basic route system. Hoenn feels wet and warm and alive with a vitality that is partly its tropical climate and partly the specific energy of a region sitting atop forces that could shift it at any moment. Sinnoh's northern cold, its mountain ranges and its lakes and its sense of geological scale gives it a weight that the other regions do not quite have. The myth of Sinnoh is the biggest myth in the franchise. The creation of the universe itself and the landscape of Sinnoh seems to know this, to carry within its mountains and its deep lakes and its perpetually snowing northern roots the awareness of having been shaped by forces larger than any other region has had to contend with. Standing at the base of Mount Coronet, looking up at the mountain that Regigigas raised and that Arceus's creation ultimately produced, a player can feel the scale of the mythology in the scale of the landscape in a way that the other regions do not quite make available. Unova's urban density is this defining quality, the sense of being in a place where many different communities have chosen to live in close proximity and have developed the texture of a place that has absorbed and transformed many different influences. Castelia City's towers and Nimbasa City's entertainment district and the sports stadiums and the Route 4 desert that separates the eastern and western halves of the region. Each of these is a different expression of Unova's character, the character of a region that is diverse and ambitious and slightly overwhelming in its variety. Unova is the franchise's New York, and it communicates that identity not just through its visual design, but through the density and variety of its characters and stories, and the feeling that whatever you are interested in, Unova has it somewhere. Kalos's French inspiration produces a different kind of beauty, more formal and more self-consciously aesthetic, concerned with light and color, and the pleasure of looking in a way that the other regions are not quite as explicitly committed to. Lumiosa City's radiating boulevards, its cafes and its Pokémon showcase venue and its art museum suggest a culture that has decided that beauty itself is a worthy object of cultivation, that the arrangement of things to be pleasing to the eye is a legitimate and important form of attention. Kalos's route design reflects this, with more scenic overlooks and more attention to the visual composition of the landscape as the player traverses it. Alola's island chain produces a different relationship with space than the mainland regions. The ocean between islands is not simply water to cross, but a boundary between different ecologies, different communities, different spirits of place. Each island in Alola has its own character, Melamelazi with its welcoming small-town warmth, Akala with its geological drama and its cultural richness, Ula Ula with its industrial infrastructure and its more complex social texture, Pony with its ancient ruins and its sense of things that predate everything else the player has encountered. The islands are not simply different zones of a single continuous landscape. They are different worlds held together by the surrounding sea and by the shared cultural traditions that the island trials represent. Galar's train-connected landscape, its industrial north and its pastoral south, and its sporting culture, and its historic wilderness, reflects a British inspiration that is as coherent as Kalos's French one, without being simply a repetition of the same relationship between real-world place and fictional region. Galar's identity is organized around competition and spectatorship, around the collective experience of watching extraordinary battling in massive stadiums, around the particular English love of tradition and eccentricity and the coexistence of the very old and the very new in the same landscape. The Crown Tundra's ancient frozen landscape and the Isle of Armor's training tradition add depth to a region that the base game renders primarily in terms of its sporting culture, showing that Galar too has its layers of history and mythology beneath the contemporary surface. Paldea's open landscapes, its varied biomes visible simultaneously from high ground, its Mediterranean warmth, and its ancient roots alongside its modern school culture, produce a region that feels genuinely inhabited in a way that earlier regions did not quite achieve. The wild Pokémon that roam freely across the landscape, rather than being encountered in tall grass, the communities visible in the distance before you arrive at them, the evidence of agricultural and commercial activity, and the details of the settlements, all of this creates a world that feels less like a game environment and more like a place, a region that exists in 3 dimensions and continues to exist in those 3 dimensions when you look away from the horizon. The world keeps being built. Each generation adds to it, and the sum of all these regions, all these landscapes, all these carefully rendered places, and all the myths and histories and ecological relationships that define them, is a world large enough to hold a timeline that stretches from the void to the present and forward into the unknown future, a world worth building, worth inhabiting, worth returning to. The traditions of Pokémon naming across regions reveal something about what each culture values in its relationship with Pokémon. Names like Bulbasaur, Charmander, and Squirtle carry a whimsical quality that feels like the names a child might give, names that contain within them a description of the creature without fully constraining it. Bulbasaur is a bulb and a saurus, a planted dinosaur, but it is also already the specific creature named Bulbasaur, in a way that makes the etymology feel like a discovery rather than a label. Mewtwo's name is different in character, colder, more clinical, the name that someone who was working on a project would give to the second version of something, and the chill of that name reflects the circumstances of Mewtwo's creation more accurately than any warmer name could. The Japanese names for many Pokémon carry different layers of meaning than the English localization names, and scholars of the franchise who know both languages sometimes find that the original name reveals something about the design intent that the translated name obscures. Hitokage, the Japanese name for Charmander, means small fire or lizard fire, a simpler and more direct description than the English name's combination of char and salamander. Fushigadane, the Japanese name for Bulbasaur, means strange seed, which emphasizes the mystery of the bulb on its back in a way that the English name does not quite. These naming philosophies are not better or worse than each other. They reflect different sensibilities about how a creature should be named, different decisions about whether a name should be descriptive, or poetic, or playful, or clinical. The professor naming convention, naming each regional professor after a type of tree, is one of the franchise's most consistent and most quietly charming running jokes. Oak, elm, birch, rowan, juniper, sycamore, kukui, magnolia, Sonia, who inherits the tradition from her grandmother, Willow in the mobile game, each name a tree, each tree chosen with some thought for the character's qualities. Oak is ancient and strong, elm is tall and scholarly, birch is active and outdoors-minded, rowan is serious and northern, juniper is warm and maternal, sycamore is elegant and continental. The naming convention gives the professors a shared identity across their differences, a sense that they are all part of the same tradition of scholarly engagement with Pokémon, regardless of what region they inhabit. The rival characters across the games carry their own naming traditions and their own thematic development across the franchise's history. Blue, or Gary in the anime, set the template for the dismissive rival who believes themselves superior, who must be defeated repeatedly before acknowledging the player's worth. Silver in Johto darkened this into genuine hostility, a rival whose dismissal of Pokémon as tools reflected a damaged relationship with trust and affection that the games allowed to slowly heal across the course of the journey. The gentler rivals of later generations, Bianca and Sharon in Unova, Shauna and Tierno and Trevor in Kalos, Hao in Alola, each representing a different kind of friendship that does not depend on competitive dominance for its texture, reflect an evolution in the franchise's thinking about what the rival relationship should model for its players. The player character's own silence, the absence of any voiced dialogue, the player's choices being made visible only through their Pokémon team and their movement through the world, is among the franchise's most consistent and most deliberate design choices. The silent protagonist is an invitation, a space into which the player is meant to project themselves, a character defined entirely by what the player does with them rather than by what the game tells the player they are. The emotional weight of the player character's journey comes from the player's attachment to the Pokémon they travel with, rather than from the player character's expressed feelings about that attachment. The silence is a form of respect, an acknowledgement that what the player feels about their journey is their own to hold, not the game's to tell them they should feel. And perhaps that is the truest thing about the Pokémon world and its long history. It is a world built to be traveled in silence, to be inhabited from the inside, to be made meaningful by what each individual player brings to it, rather than by what it insists they find. The mythology is real. The history is rich. The creatures are genuinely extraordinary in ways that repay sustained attention. But all of it is in service of the moment when a player, any player, holds a Pokeball and knows that what is inside it is theirs, is known to them, has been through things with them, and will be there for whatever comes next, on whatever route the morning opens. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed drifting through these quiet moments, there's another video waiting on the left of your screen. Let it play while you rest. You might discover something gentle before sleep takes you again.